Frozen wolves seek shelter from humble man, but he's stunned by their reaction. Walter Thompson never imagined that at 68 years old, his solitary life in the Blue Ridge Mountains would be interrupted so unexpectedly. The old man with a long beard and melancholy gaze had grown accustomed to the loneliness of the past 7 years. It was on an especially harsh winter night that everything changed. The temperature had plummeted to alarming levels, something rare even for the standards of Colorado's mountainous region. Walter was sitting on his wooden stool, watching the fire crackling in the rustic fireplace of his cabin, when he heard strange sounds at the door. Not knocks, but desperate scratches and sharp whines cutting through the silence of the freezing night. "Who on earth is there?" Walter murmured, grabbing his old kerosene lantern. As he opened the door, the biting wind carried fragments of ice that struck his wrinkled face. But what truly surprised him was the sight of 3 maned wolves, shivering violently, their paws reddened by the extreme cold, huddled against the wooden porch as if begging for shelter. "What in the world?" the old man exclaimed, taking a step back. The largest of the animals, a male with golden-red fur and dark paws and muzzle, looked directly at Walter. His amber eyes seemed to hold an ancient wisdom, a silent plea that transcended the barrier between species. The other 2, smaller and visibly younger, trembled so intensely that Walter could hear their teeth chattering. Something in those animals' gaze made him hesitate. In all his years living in the mountains, he had never seen maned wolves approach humans like this, much less seek shelter in a cabin. They were elusive, solitary creatures that rarely came near human dwellings. Something very serious must be happening. "You'll leave as soon as the storm passes," he said aloud as if the animals could understand him, opening the door wider to let them in. The 3 wolves didn't need a second invitation. They entered cautiously, keeping their distance from Walter, and approached the fireplace as if they knew exactly what the fire was for. The oldest of the 3, the one with amber eyes, was visibly limping, leaving a faint trail of blood on the wooden floor. Walter closed the door, blocking the furious howl of the wind. He watched in amazement as the animals behaved. There was none of the wildness he expected, just 3 exhausted creatures seeking warmth and safety. "You must be hungry, I suppose," he murmured, more to himself than to the wolves. He went to the small cupboard where he kept his provisions and took out a piece of dried meat. He hesitated for a moment, but then divided the meat into 3 portions and placed them on separate plates on the floor, at a safe distance from the animals. Then he filled a bowl with fresh water and set it beside the food. The injured wolf, the one with amber eyes, was the first to approach. Carefully he drank some water and then looked at Walter as if in thanks. The other 2 followed his lead shortly after. Walter sat in his rocking chair and observed the strange visitors. There was something deeply unsettling about the way the oldest wolf stared at him, not with fear or aggression, but with a kind of recognition, almost as if he already knew him. "You're strange creatures," Walter remarked, rocking slowly in his chair. "Showing up here like this, as if you knew I'd open the door." The wind outside grew stronger, making the cabin walls creak. The approaching storm promised to be one of the worst of the winter, and even Walter, accustomed to solitude and isolation, felt an odd comfort in not being completely alone that night. As he watched the 3 maned wolves settle near the fireplace, he couldn't have imagined how that unlikely encounter would completely change the course of his solitary existence. The next morning, Walter woke to the first rays of sunlight slipping through the cracks in the wooden windows. For a moment, he thought he had dreamed about the wolves, but when he looked at the floor near the fireplace, there they were, the 3 wild animals, sleeping peacefully. "They're still here," he murmured, scratching his thick white beard. The amber-eyed wolf, the eldest, lifted its head at the sound of his voice. Its right front paw was still injured, the fur stained with dried blood. Walter realized the wound was worse than he had thought the night before. With a sigh, the old man rose from his makeshift bed and went to a wooden chest in the corner of the cabin. From it, he pulled out a small box he hadn't opened in years, his first aid kit, a remnant of his former life when he still lived in town and worked as a nurse at the regional hospital in Riverdale. "Never thought I'd use this on a wolf," he said, cautiously approaching the injured animal. To his surprise, the wolf didn't retreat. It stayed perfectly still as Walter knelt beside it, watching him with those intense amber eyes. "I'll clean this," Walter explained, as if speaking to a human patient. "It'll sting a bit." Gently, he cleaned the wound with hydrogen peroxide, noticing it was a deep cut, likely from barbed wire. Then he applied antiseptic and wrapped the paw with a clean bandage. Throughout the whole process, the wolf didn't make a single sound of pain or discomfort, remaining stoically still, watching. Walter with an unsettling trust. "There," the old man said, stepping back. "That should help it heal." Then something extraordinary happened. The injured wolf, now with its paw bandaged, carefully stood and approached Walter. Before the man could pull away, the animal gently pressed its snout against his hand, a gesture that seemed unmistakably like gratitude. Walter froze. In all his years living in the mountains, he had never seen such behavior from a wild animal. It was as if the wolf understood exactly what he had done and wanted to thank him. "You really are a strange creature," Walter murmured, allowing himself for the first time to lightly touch the animal's head. The fur was softer than he had imagined, and the wolf closed its eyes briefly at the human touch, as if savoring the contact. The other two wolves, younger ones, watched the scene curiously, still keeping a respectful distance. Walter noticed they were a female and a male, likely from the same litter, perhaps offspring of the older wolf. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, continuing. The day passed slowly. The snowstorm had left the outside world completely white, with drifts partially blocking the cabin door. Even if he had wanted to, Walter couldn't have left to go to the nearest village, which was nearly 10 miles away. And the wolves, to his surprise, showed no intention of leaving. The eldest, whom he had begun to think of as the old sage, because of its piercing gaze, rested quietly near the fireplace, sparing its injured paw. The younger ones alternated between sleeping and curiously exploring the corners of the cabin, always respecting Walter's space, never touching anything that wasn't offered to them. At noon, as Walter was preparing a simple vegetable stew, with the few supplies he still had, he noticed the female maned wolf watching him intently. "You're hungry, aren't you?" he asked. "Well, I don't have much meat to offer today." As if understanding his words perfectly, the she-wolf stood up and went to the door, scratching it lightly with her paw. "Do you want to go out?" Walter asked, moving closer to open the door. "It's snowing hard out there." When he opened the door, a gust of icy wind swept into the cabin. The she-wolf darted out quickly, disappearing into the whiteness of the outside world. Walter felt an unexpected pang of worry. Will she come back? He wondered aloud. The old sage, from where he lay, made a soft sound, almost a reassuring purr, as if to say everything would be fine. Walter closed the door and returned to his stew, trying not to dwell on the strange tightness in his chest when he saw the she-wolf leave. He was getting emotionally attached to these wild animals, something he had promised himself he would never do again. Getting involved, forming bonds, opening himself up to the possibility of loss. Just 2 hours later, as Walter absent-mindedly stirred the stew simmering on the wood stove, he heard scratching at the door. When he opened it, he found the she-wolf had returned, carrying a freshly caught hare in her mouth. "My goodness," Walter murmured, astonished. The she-wolf stepped calmly inside and laid the prey at his feet like an offering. Her eyes, a lighter yellow than the old sage's, seemed expectant, waiting for some kind of approval. "You hunted this for me?" Walter asked, unable to believe what he was seeing. The she-wolf sat back on her haunches, her tail giving a slight wag, her eyes fixed on him. The old man glanced at the old sage, who watched the scene with what seemed like satisfaction, then at the younger wolf, who now approached to inspect the catch. "This is—" Walter couldn't finish the sentence. There was something happening here that defied everything he knew about wild animals. With trembling hands, he picked up the hare and carried it to his small prep table. He felt the eyes of all 3 wolves on him as he cleaned and prepared the animal for cooking. He decided to add the meat to the stew, which instantly took on a richer, heartier aroma. When the meal was ready, Walter served portions for himself and the 3 wolves, placing their dishes on the floor. For the first time in many years, he didn't eat alone. There was a strange sense of familiarity, of communion, as the four of them shared the meal they had in a way prepared together. That night, as Walter lay in his simple bed, bundled under heavy blankets to ward off the cold, he felt a gentle weight at the foot of it. Lifting his head, he saw the old sage had climbed up and settled near him. The other two wolves remained, on the floor but close to the bed like silent sentinels. "You really are strange creatures," Walter murmured, but he made no move to shoo the animal away. Instead, he reached out and lightly touched the old sage's head, who closed his eyes with what seemed like contentment. That night, for the first time since losing his family, Walter Thompson did not feel alone. The following days established an unexpected routine in the isolated cabin. The storm continued, keeping Walter and his three visitors confined together. The old man watched with fascination as the wolves seemed to adapt perfectly to life inside the cabin, as if they understood the unspoken rules of coexistence. The old sage, whose injury was already showing signs of improvement thanks to Walter's care, often spent hours simply observing him as he went about his daily tasks. There was an intelligence in those amber eyes that went beyond anything Walter had ever witnessed in any animal. The two younger ones, which he had begun to call Swift, the female, and Watcher, the male, seemed to have taken on specific roles. Swift would regularly go out to hunt, always returning with prey to share with the others. Watcher appeared to have taken it upon himself to monitor the surroundings of the cabin, letting out a low whine whenever he heard distant sounds. One particularly cold morning, Walter realized his supplies were running low. The flour, salt, and oil were gone, and only a few wilted vegetables remained in the small pantry. If the storm didn't let up soon, he'd be in trouble. As if sensing his worry, the old sage approached and rested his head on Walter's knee as he sat in his rocking chair. "I'm fine," Walter said, stroking the wolf's head. "Just worried about food. If the snow keeps up like this..." He was interrupted by a whine from Watcher, who stood near the window. The young wolf was alert, ears pricked, body tense. "What is it?" Walter asked, standing up. As he neared the window, he wiped the fogged glass and tried to peer through the white curtain of snow. At first he saw nothing but the frozen landscape. Then he spotted movement, a dark figure struggling through the deep snow toward the cabin. "Someone's coming," Walter murmured, a pang of unease tightening his chest. He had lived in near isolation for 7 years, with only occasional visits from the mail carrier or a villager checking to see if he was still alive. He didn't appreciate intrusions into his solitude. The old sage joined him at the window, watching as well. Defying all expectations, the wolf showed no sign of alarm or aggression. Instead, he seemed just as curious as Walter about the unexpected visitor. As the figure drew closer, Walter could make out more details. A woman, fighting her way through the deep snow, carrying something on her back. She wore a heavy coat with a hood, but even so she seemed to be suffering in the bitter cold. "My God, she'll freeze out there," Walter muttered. Without a second thought, he grabbed his coat and headed for the door. The three wolves watched. Him, perfectly calm, as if they understood exactly what was happening. "Stay here," Walter ordered before stepping outside. The icy wind nearly knocked him over as he opened the door. The snow was deep, nearly up to his knees, and each step was a struggle. Still, he pressed forward toward the woman, who had now stopped, likely spotting him. "Hey!" Walter shouted, his voice almost swallowed by the wind. "This way!" When he got close enough, he saw she was younger than he'd thought, maybe in her early 30s. Her face was red from the cold, lips slightly blue, and she was visibly shaking. "Thank God," she said, her voice trembling. "I thought no one lived out here." "Come on, it's too cold," Walter replied, offering his arm to help her toward the cabin. Only then did he notice what she was carrying, a large, clearly heavy backpack filled with what looked like scientific equipment. "I'm Walter," he introduced himself shortly as they trudged through the snow. "Emily," she replied between gasps. "Emily Parker. I'm a researcher at Colorado State University. I was surveying the local wildlife when the storm hit." Walter nodded, asking no further questions. His priority was getting her out of the deadly cold. When they finally reached the cabin door, he hesitated for a moment, remembering the 3 wolves inside. I have a few visitors in my cabin," he said, uncertain how to explain the unusual situation. "Visitors?" asked Emily, her voice weak from the cold and exhaustion. "Yes, well, you'll see. Don't be alarmed, they're peaceful." Before Emily could question what he meant, Walter opened the door. The welcoming warmth of the cabin greeted them, along with the sight of the 3 maned wolves sitting calmly near the fireplace, watching the newcomers with quiet curiosity. Emily froze in the doorway, her eyes wide with shock. "My God, and they're maned wolves!" she exclaimed, her voice a mix of fear and professional fascination. "Yes," confirmed Walter, closing the door behind them. "They showed up during the storm a few days ago. The oldest one was injured." Emily remained still, clearly trying to process the scene before her. 3 rare, typically elusive wild predators behaving like domestic animals in an isolated cabin. "This is extraordinary," she murmured, the tremor in her voice now more from excitement than cold. "I've been studying this very species. For years, I've tried to get close to maned wolves in their natural habitat, without success." The old sage, as if understanding he was the topic of conversation, slowly stood and took a few steps toward the humans. Emily instinctively stepped back. "Don't worry," Walter reassured her. "He won't attack. In fact, he seems to understand more than he should." The wolf stopped at a respectful distance, sat back on his haunches, and simply watched Emily with his piercing amber eyes. His paw, it's bandaged, Emily noticed, pointing to the dressing Walter had applied. Yes, he was hurt when he arrived. A deep cut, probably from barbed wire. Emily slowly removed her heavy snow-soaked coat, revealing a wool sweater underneath. Her eyes never left the wolves, especially the old sage. "Mr. Thompson, what's happening here is unprecedented in scientific literature," she said softly, almost reverently. "Maned wolves are extremely elusive. They don't interact with humans like this. They don't form packs, and they certainly don't show this kind of almost domestic behavior." Walter shrugged, as if the extraordinary situation were perfectly normal. "They showed up at my door. During the worst night of the storm. They were freezing. What was I supposed to do, let them die in the cold?" The simplicity of his answer seemed to touch Emily deeply. She studied the old man with new eyes, his long white beard, his weathered face marked by time and experience, his clear eyes that had seen much of life. There was a kindness behind his rugged appearance that contrasted with the self-imposed isolation he lived in. "You saved their lives," she said gently. Walter shifted uncomfortably at the remark, as if unaccustomed to any kind of praise. "Come, warm yourself by the fire," he said, changing the subject. "I'll make some hot tea to chase the chill from your bones." As Walter set water to boil, Emily cautiously approached the fireplace, keeping the wolves in her line of sight. To her surprise, the animals seemed perfectly at ease with her presence, merely watching her with calm curiosity. "I've never seen anything like this," she remarked, sitting on the small stool Walter indicated. "Have you given them names?" Walter hesitated, looking slightly embarrassed. "Well, not exactly names, I just call them by their traits. The oldest one, with the injured paw, I call the old sage. The female, who hunts for us, is Swift. And the other male, always alert, is Watcher." "They hunt for you?" Emily asked, unable to hide her astonishment. "Swift brings hares, sometimes a small rodent. We share the meals." Emily shook her head, amazed. "This challenges everything we know about this species' behavior. It's more like grey wolves, which form cooperative packs, than maned wolves, which are usually solitary. It's as if—" She stopped suddenly, her scientific eyes noticing something she hadn't seen before. "Mr. Walter, may I take a closer look at the old sage?" Walter glanced at the older wolf, who returned his gaze as if they were silently consulting each other. After a moment, the old man nodded. "I don't think he'll mind, but go slowly." Emily approached the old sage cautiously, who remained perfectly still, watching her with those piercing eyes. When she was close enough, the researcher studied the animal's features intently. "His markings, the skull structure," she murmured, more to herself than to Walter. "There's something different." "What do you mean?" asked Walter, bringing 2 mugs of hot tea. Emily accepted the mug, her eyes still fixed on the wolf. "Typical maned wolves have very specific traits," she explained. "This one seems to have subtle anatomical differences. His ears are slightly smaller, the snout a bit wider, the coat denser." She paused, taking a sip of tea. "Almost as if there's some genetic mixing with another canid species." Walter sat in his rocking chair, watching Emily and the old sage. "And is that important?" "It could be extremely important," Emily replied, scientific excitement clear in her voice. "If we're looking at a natural genetic variation, or even a hybrid, this would be a significant discovery for the species' conservation. They're endangered." The old sage, as if tired of being the center of attention, calmly stood and went to lie near the other two wolves, who were curled up together by the fireplace. "They look like a family," Emily remarked, "which is extraordinary, considering adult maned wolves don't usually form stable family groups." Walter watched the three animals with a mix of affection and puzzlement. "I think they are, in a way. The old sage seems to care for the younger ones, and they respect him." Emily turned to face Walter, her eyes bright with scientific excitement and genuine curiosity about the man before her. "Mr. Walter, do you realize you're at the center of something extraordinary here? These animals are displaying behaviors never before scientifically documented, and they chose you." Walter shifted, uncomfortably in his chair. He wasn't used to being the center of attention, much less being considered special in any way. For the past 7 years, he'd tried to be invisible, to disappear into the mountains with his pain and memories. "It was just coincidence," he muttered. "My cabin was the only shelter available during the storm." Emily shook her head slowly. "I don't believe in coincidences like that. There are thousands of cabins and buildings scattered across these mountains. Why yours?" The question hung in the air unanswered. Walter looked away, clearly uneasy with where the conversation was heading. "Tell me, Emily," he said, deliberately changing the subject. "How do you plan to get back to town in this weather?" The researcher accepted the shift, though her gaze suggested she hadn't forgotten the earlier question. "I can't return until the storm passes," she replied. "I came here by jeep, but it got stuck in the snow a few miles back. I had to continue, on foot, hoping to find shelter." "The storm could last a few more days from the looks of it," Walter commented, glancing out the window at the heavy sky. "Would you mind if I stayed?" asked Emily hesitantly. "I promise not to be a bother." Actually, she looked at the wolves with a spark of excitement in her eyes. "I'd love the chance to observe these animals up close. It's an opportunity no researcher has ever had." Walter hesitated. He had grown accustomed to his solitude, interrupted only by the silent presence of the wolves. The idea of sharing his space with another human, especially a curious scientist full of questions, wasn't particularly appealing. But something in Emily's hopeful gaze, combined with the undeniable fact that she had nowhere else to go, softened his resolve. "You can stay," he finally said, "but I have few supplies and only one bed." "Don't worry about that," Emily replied quickly. "I have a sleeping bag in my backpack and some dehydrated food too. And as for supplies..." She smiled, looking at Swift. "It seems we have a skilled hunter in the group." At that moment, as if understanding she was being mentioned, Swift lifted her head and fixed her yellow eyes on Emily. There was an intelligence in that gaze that made the scientist hold her breath. "It's almost like they understand what we're saying," Emily murmured. "I've thought the same," Walter admitted, "especially the old sage. Sometimes I get the feeling he knows exactly what I'm thinking." A comfortable silence settled over the cabin, broken only by the crackling of the firewood and the distant howl of the wind. Outside, the storm raged on, isolating that small refuge from the rest of the world. Inside, an unlikely group of a lonely old man, a curious scientist, and 3 maned wolves found a strange balance none of them could have predicted. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now continuing, the following days established a surprisingly harmonious routine in the small cabin. Emily adapted quickly to the simple life, helping Walter with daily chores and spending hours, observing and documenting the wolves' behavior in her small notebook. For Walter, Emily's presence brought an unexpected change, After years cultivating silence and solitude, he was surprised by how easily he grew accustomed to human company. Again, the scientist had a genuine curiosity, not just for the wolves but also for the region, the medicinal plants Walter grew, and the survival techniques he'd perfected over the years. On a particularly cold morning, as they prepared a strong coffee, together, Emily finally asked the question Walter knew would come eventually. "Why do you live here so isolated?" she asked softly, as if afraid to break some invisible spell with words spoken aloud. Walter stayed silent for a long moment, stirring the coffee in his metal mug. Across the cabin, the old sage lifted his head, his amber eyes fixed on Walter, as if also waiting for the answer. "There was a time when I lived in the city," he began at last, his voice low and a bit rough. "In Riverdale. I had a different life, a family." Emily said nothing, patiently waiting for him to continue. "My wife Elizabeth was a teacher at the local school. We had a son, Peter. He was 12 when—" Walter paused, his hand gripping the mug so tightly his knuckles turned white. "It happened during a flood," he went on, staring at the fire rather than Emily. "The river overflowed after days of heavy rain. Our house was in an area that had never been hit before, so we didn't evacuate in time." Walter took a deep breath as if each word required immense physical effort. "I was on duty at the hospital that night. By the time I learned of the danger, it was already too late. The waters—" He shook his head, unable to finish the sentence. "I'm so sorry," murmured Emily, her voice heavy with genuine compassion. "I couldn't save them," said Walter, as if that were the only thing that mattered. "After that, I couldn't stay in town any longer. Every street, every person, every place. It all reminded me of what I'd lost. So I came here. This cabin belonged to my grandfather. I spent summers here as a child." Silence fell over them again, thick with the weight of the shared story. It was broken by the soft sound of paws on the wooden floor. The old sage had approached, and in a gesture that seemed impossible for a wild animal, gently rested his head on Walter's knee. Emily watched the scene with misty eyes. There was something deeply moving about the way the wolf seemed to offer comfort, as if he perfectly understood human pain. "It's extraordinary," she whispered. "It's almost like he understands," Walter finished, softly stroking the wolf's head. "Yes, I know. From the very first moment our eyes met, I felt it. A kind of recognition." Emily gazed thoughtfully at the old sage. "You know, there's a theory among some behavioral biologists," she began, "the idea that highly intelligent animals can develop a kind of cross-species empathy, the ability to recognize and respond to the suffering of other creatures." Walter nodded slowly. "When I was a nurse, I saw something similar a few times. Therapy animals that seemed to know exactly which patient needed comfort most that day. But this—" Emily gestured to the old sage, who still had his head on Walter's knee. "This goes beyond. This is a wild animal, not trained to interact with humans." And yet, at that moment, Watcher and Swift, who had been near the window, began to whimper, softly, alert. Walter and Emily exchanged worried glances. "What is it?" Emily asked, standing up. Walter rose as well, moving to the window. He wiped a circle in the fogged glass and peered outside. The storm had eased considerably overnight, and now only scattered flakes fell from the grey sky. "There's someone coming," he said, frowning. "Looks like more than one person." Emily joined him at the window, watching the distant figures slowly approaching through the deep snow. There were 3 men, all dressed in heavy winter gear, carrying what looked like search equipment. "They must be looking for me," Emily said with a mix of relief and strange disappointment. "When I didn't return on schedule, the university probably called for a mountain rescue." Walter felt an inexplicable tightness in his chest. The thought of Emily leaving, of his cabin returning to its former silence, brought him an unexpected sadness. "Yes, that must be it," he said, stepping back from the window. The 3 wolves were visibly agitated now. Watcher stayed near the door, ears pricked, body tense. Swift paced restlessly around the cabin, while the old sage watched Walter with what looked like concern in his amber eyes. "They seem nervous," Emily remarked. "Maybe we should hide them before the men arrive. We don't know how they'd react to seeing manned wolves inside a cabin." Walter nodded slowly, though something told him hiding the wolves wouldn't be so simple. They weren't pets that could be locked in a room. "There's a small room in the back," he said. "Used for storing firewood and tools. Maybe we can persuade them to stay there for now." Emily agreed, and together they tried to guide the wolves to the back room. To his surprise, Watcher and Swift followed without resistance, as if they understood the need to hide. Old Sage, however, hesitated at the bedroom door, his eyes fixed on Walter. "It's all right," the old man murmured. "It's just for a little while." The wolf tilted his head slightly in an almost human-like gesture of understanding, and finally entered the room. Walter closed the door carefully, feeling strangely guilty for confining the animals. "They're truly extraordinary," Emily remarked. "The way they seem to understand." Her words were cut off by firm knocks on the front door. The men had arrived faster than expected. Walter took a deep breath and went to answer. When he opened the door, he was met by 3 burly men with serious, concerned expressions. "Good morning," greeted the one who appeared to be the leader. "We're from the Blue Ridge Mountains Search and Rescue Team. We're looking for Emily Parker, a researcher from Colorado State University who disappeared 3 days ago in this area." Before Walter could respond, Emily appeared at his side, smiling in relief. "That's me. I'm fine, thanks to Mr. Thompson here. He gave me shelter during the storm." The 3 men visibly relaxed. The leader, a middle-aged man with a graying beard, extended his hand to Walter. "Thank you for looking after her, sir. I'm Robert, the team coordinator. These are Jason and Brian." Walter shook the offered hand, feeling uneasy with the sudden presence of so many people in his private space. "It was nothing," he murmured. "Anyone would have done the same." "May I come in?" Emily asked the men. "I need to get my things." They agreed but stayed near the door, clearly not wanting to impose more than necessary. As Emily gathered her equipment, Walter noticed a shift in the atmosphere, a silence from the back room that somehow felt wrong. Robert, noticing Walter's expression, asked, "Is everything all right, sir?" "Yes," Walter replied quickly. "Just worried about the weather. It seems like it's going to get bad again." The rescue team leader nodded. "Yes, we only have a small window of clear weather. That's why we came as soon as we could. Another cold front is expected tonight." Emily returned with her backpack and gear neatly packed. "I'm ready," she said, though her voice betrayed reluctance. Then it happened. A sharp whine followed. By desperate scratching came from the back room. The 3 rescue team members immediately went on alert. "What was that?" Robert asked, his hand instinctively moving to the survival knife at his belt. Walter and Emily exchanged uneasy glances. "I have some unexpected visitors too," Walter said hesitantly. Before he could explain further, the backroom door burst open. Old Sage emerged first, followed by Watcher and Swift. The 3 wolves stopped in the center of the room, staring at the strangers with a mix of caution and determination. "My God!" exclaimed Jason, the youngest of the team, taking a step back. "They're maned wolves." Robert and Brian also recoiled, their expressions torn between fear and astonishment. "Sir, step back slowly," Robert instructed, his voice tense. "These are dangerous wild animals." Walter, however, didn't move. Instead, to everyone's shock, he calmly walked over to where the wolves stood and knelt beside Old Sage. "They're not dangerous," he said firmly. "At least not to me." Emily quickly stepped in, her scientific enthusiasm overcoming caution. "Gentlemen, you're witnessing something extraordinary," she explained. "These wolves sought shelter here during the storm. Mr. Thompson cared for them, especially the older one. He was injured. And they've been displaying completely atypical behavior for the species." The men watched in disbelief, still keeping their distance but now more curious than fearful. "Are you saying they're domesticated?" asked Brian. "Not exactly," replied Emily. "They're still wild animals, but they seem to have formed a bond with Mr. Thompson, and they're showing social behaviors among themselves that are extremely rare in adult maned wolves." Robert observed the scene before him intently. The old man kneeling beside the 3 wild predators completely at ease, and the animals just as calm in his presence. In 20 years working these mountains, I've never seen anything like this, he admitted. Neither have I after years of researching the species, Emily agreed. And there's more. I believe the oldest wolf might have unique genetic traits, possibly a natural hybrid. That would be a significant discovery for the species' conservation. Emily's enthusiasm was contagious, and the rescue team members began to relax, watching the wolves with newfound interest. "So what do you plan to do with them?" Robert asked. The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. Walter felt a tightness in his chest. The truth was, he hadn't thought much beyond the present. The wolves were here, with him, and somehow that felt right. But now, faced with the possibility of an after, he felt lost. Emily looked at Walter, sensing his dilemma. "That's a complicated question," she said carefully. "On one hand, they're wild animals, part of an endangered species. Standard protocol would be to document the encounter, and if possible, fit them with trackers before releasing them back into the wild." She paused, watching as the old sage leaned slightly against Walter's leg in a clear gesture of trust and affection. "On the other hand," she continued, "the bond they've formed with Mr. Thompson is unprecedented, and the social behavior they're displaying is also extremely unusual. That might justify a longer study." "Are you suggesting keeping them in captivity?" Jason asked with a mix of curiosity and concern. "Not exactly," Emily replied, "but perhaps a middle ground. A conservation program that lets them continue interacting with Mr. Thompson under scientific observation while gradually preparing them for eventual reintroduction into the wild." Robert's eyes lit up with understanding. "You mean the Manned Wolf Project in Mountain Valley?" he asked. "They have a research and rehabilitation station not far from here, south of the Blue Ridge." "Mountains!" Emily nodded eagerly. "Exactly. I have contacts there. They'd be fascinated by this situation, I'm sure." Walter listened with growing unease. Everyone was talking about the wolves, about studies, about scientific projects, but no one had asked what he wanted, or what the wolves themselves wanted, if such a thing even made sense. As if sensing his thoughts, the old sage turned and looked directly into Walter's eyes. There was something in that amber gaze, a question, an expectation, a silent plea. "They stay with me," Walter said suddenly, his voice firm and decisive, cutting through the scientific discussion. Everyone turned to look at him, surprised by the determination in his tone. "Mr. Thompson," Emily began gently, "I understand your affection for them, but they're wild animals from an endangered species. There are legal and conservation matters to consider." "I know," he replied, "and I'm not saying I want to keep them trapped here against their will. I'm saying they chose to stay with me for now, and I respect that choice." Robert scratched his beard thoughtfully. "This puts all of us in a difficult position," he remarked. "Technically, keeping wild animals without authorization is illegal. On the other hand," Emily interjected, "this is an unprecedented situation, and it could provide valuable data on animal behavior and species conservation." A thoughtful silence fell over the group. The three manned wolves remained calm, watching. The discussion as if they understood their fate was being decided. It was Brian, the quietest of the three men, who finally spoke. "What if it's a temporary solution?" he suggested. "Mr. Walter could keep the wolves here while Emily reports the situation to the proper authorities and the conservation project. They could send specialists to assess this unique circumstance." The suggestion seemed reasonable, a compromise that respected both conservation needs and the special bond that had formed. "That could work," Emily agreed slowly. "I could document everything scientifically, build a stronger case for special consideration in this situation." Walter looked at the three wolves, especially the old sage. For a bizarre moment, he almost felt as if he were asking the animal's opinion. The eldest wolf held his gaze, then in a gesture that seemed impossible for a wild animal, tilted its head slightly, as if in agreement. "I agree with this solution," Walter finally said. "As long as it's clear I'm not keeping these animals against their will, they're free to leave whenever they choose. The cabin door will stay unlocked." Emily smiled, relieved they had reached an agreement. I'll do everything I can to ensure this situation is handled with the respect it deserves, Mr. Walter. For you and for the wolves. Robert glanced out the window, checking the weather. We need to leave now if we want to get down the mountain before the next storm hits, he said. Emily, are you ready? The researcher nodded, but there was reluctance in her movements as she gathered the last of her belongings. When she was finally ready to leave, she turned to Walter. I'll be back in a few days if the weather allows, she promised. With representatives from the Manned Wolf Project. Please take good care of them until then. Always have, Walter replied simply. Emily hesitated, then on impulse briefly hugged the old man. Thank you for saving my life, she murmured. And for sharing this miracle with me. Walter, awkward with physical contact after so many years of solitude, only nodded, flustered. As the group prepared to leave, something unexpected happened. The old sage, who had stayed close to Walter throughout the discussion, walked over to Emily and gently touched her hand with its muzzle. The researcher froze, stunned by the deliberate gesture of a wild animal. My God, she whispered, it's like he's saying goodbye. Or, see you soon, Walter suggested with a small smile. Emily gently stroked the wolf's head, her eyes misty. See you soon then, old sage. I'll make sure you're all taken care of. With one last look at the extraordinary scene, the solitary old man and his 3 canine companions, Emily and the rescue team departed, leaving Walter alone with the wolves once more. When the door closed behind the visitors, a comforting silence filled the cabin. Walter sank heavily into his rocking chair, suddenly exhausted by the intensity of the events. The old sage moved close and lay at his feet, while Watcher and Swift returned to their favorite spots near the fireplace. It was as if a delicate balance had been restored. And now, Walter murmured to the empty air, what happens to us, my friends? In response, he received only the old sage's piercing gaze, which somehow seemed to say, we wait. Together. Outside, the first snowflakes of the new storm began to fall, but inside the cabin, a warmth that went beyond the fire in the fireplace kept the cold at bay. The following days passed at a gentle pace, yet filled with anticipation. Walter and his unlikely companions settled into a routine that worked harmoniously for everyone. In the morning, while Walter prepared coffee, Watcher and Swift would briefly patrol the area around the cabin, always returning before he finished eating. The old sage, whose paw continued to heal well under Walter's attentive care, usually stayed close by, watching the man's every move with keen, intelligent eyes. On the afternoon of the 4th day after Emily's departure, Walter noticed a change in the wolves' behavior. They were more alert, more restless. Watcher spent more time near the window, ears pricked, body tense. Swift moved nervously around, the cabin unable to settle in one spot. Even the usually calm old sage seemed agitated, lifting his head at every small sound. What's wrong? Walter asked, though he knew he wouldn't get a verbal answer. Do you sense something I can't? In response, the old sage stood and went to the door, looking back at Walter with an expectant expression. The other 2 wolves quickly joined him. You want to go out? Walter asked, feeling a twinge of apprehension. Now? In this weather? The storm had eased since the day before, but snow still fell steadily, and the sky remained heavy and grey. The old sage scratched lightly at the door, his amber eyes fixed on Walter, communicating something the man felt but couldn't put into words. With a resigned sigh, Walter put on his heavy coat and opened the door. The 3 wolves stepped out immediately, but to his surprise, they didn't run into the woods. Instead, they stopped a few yards from the cabin and looked back at him, clearly waiting for him to follow. You want me to come with you? Walter asked, incredulous. The old sage let out a low whine, almost an affirmation. This is crazy, Walter muttered to himself, but he closed the cabin door and followed the animals. The wolves moved slowly, clearly adjusting their pace so the older man could keep up. They walked for about 20 minutes, following a path that seemed deliberately chosen by the old sage, who led the small group. The snow had piled up significantly over the past few days, making the trek difficult for Walter. But there was an urgency in the wolves' behavior that pushed him forward. despite his fatigue and the cold seeping through his gloves. Finally, they reached a small clearing surrounded by snow-laden pine trees. The old sage stopped abruptly, his body tense. Watcher and Swift also halted, their noses pointed towards something at the center of the clearing. Walter squinted, trying to see through the steady snowfall. At first, he could make out nothing but a dark mound partially covered in snow. Then, as he moved closer, his heart nearly stopped. It was a man lying face down in the snow, motionless. "My God!" Walter exclaimed, rushing forward as fast as his aging legs would carry him. He knelt beside the fallen figure and carefully turned him over. It was a young man, perhaps in his 30s, with unshaven stubble and a face pale from the cold. He wore high-quality hiking gear, but it was inadequate for the severe storm that had battered the region in recent days. With fingers trembling from cold and adrenaline, Walter checked the man's pulse. It was weak, but there. "He's alive," he murmured, more to himself than to the manned wolves, who had approached and were now watching the scene with what seemed like genuine concern. The stranger was clearly suffering from advanced hypothermia. Without immediate treatment, he wouldn't survive much longer. Walter looked around, assessing the situation. They were at least a 15-minute walk from his cabin, and the man was far too heavy for him to carry alone. "We need help," he said, looking at the wolves as if he truly expected them to understand. "I can't carry him by myself." To his astonishment, the old sage seemed to understand. The wolf exchanged a glance with Watcher, who immediately took off, running swiftly through the snow in the direction they had come from. "Did he go to get help?" Walter muttered, incredulous. "That's impossible." As they waited, Walter did what he could for the unconscious man. He rummaged through the stranger's bags and found an emergency thermal blanket, which he used to cover him. He rubbed his arms and legs to stimulate circulation, speaking to him constantly, though there was no response. "Everything will be okay," he repeated. "Help is on the way." The old sage and Swift stayed close, their bodies providing extra warmth as they pressed against the fallen man. Swift occasionally licked the stranger's face as if trying to rouse him. Time seemed to drag. The snow fell steadily, piling up on them despite Walter's efforts to keep it off. The cold seeped deeper into his bones, and he began to fear, not just for the stranger's life, but for his own. "Where is Watcher?" he murmured, his worry growing with each passing minute. Then they heard it, the sound of human voices calling in the distance, accompanied by Watcher's familiar bark. "Over here!" Walter shouted with all the strength he could muster. "We're here!" Minutes later, 3 figures emerged through the snow-laden trees. Robert and Jason from the rescue team followed closely by Watcher, who bounded through the deep snow with obvious urgency. "Mr. Thompson!" Robert exclaimed, rushing toward him. "What happened?" "This man," Walter replied, his voice shaky from the cold. "The wolves found him. He's severely hypothermic." The 2 men immediately shifted into professional mode, kneeling beside the unconscious stranger and assessing his condition. Jason quickly opened his backpack, pulling out emergency medical supplies. "How did you get here so fast?" Walter asked, confused. "We were already on our way to your cabin just now," Robert explained as he helped Jason prepare an emergency stretcher. "Emily came back with us, along with an expert from the Manned Wolf Project. We were less than a kilometer away when your wolf found us." "Watcher came to you on purpose?" Walter asked, still struggling to believe what had happened. "I've never seen anything like it," Robert admitted, looking at the wolf with admiration. As it stood guard nearby, he appeared right in front of us, barking and running in circles. When we tried to keep going, he blocked our path, clearly wanting us to follow him, like he knew exactly what he was doing. Jason, who had been checking the unconscious man's vitals, looked up with a grave expression. "He's in critical condition, but stable enough to be moved. We need to get him to a warm place immediately." "My cabin is the nearest shelter," Walter said. "We can take him there." With the efficiency born of years of experience, Robert and Jason transferred the stranger onto the emergency stretcher and began the difficult task of carrying him through the deep snow. Walter followed close behind, accompanied by the 3 maned wolves, who seemed to fully grasp the gravity of the situation. When they finally spotted the cabin, they saw 2 figures anxiously waiting at the door. Emily and a man Walter didn't recognize, likely the specialist from the Manned Wolf Project. "Thank heavens," Emily exclaimed as she saw them emerge from the snowy forest. "We were so worried." She rushed to help, followed by the stranger, a middle-aged man with glasses who wore an expression of utter astonishment at the sight of the three manned wolves calmly walking beside Walter. "What happened?" Emily asked, steadying the stretcher as they approached the cabin. "The wolves found a man collapsed in the snow," Walter explained briefly. "They led me to him. Watcher went to get help and found you." Emily exchanged a meaningful glance with the bespectacled man, who looked increasingly bewildered by what he was witnessing. "Mr. Walter, this is Dr. Richard Martin from the Manned Wolf Project," Emily introduced as they entered the cabin. "He came to assess our unique situation." The doctor nodded in greeting, but was clearly more preoccupied with the wolves than social formalities at the moment. "This is absolutely unprecedented," he murmured, watching as the three manned wolves calmly entered the cabin, keeping a respectful distance while Robert and Jason placed the unconscious man near the fireplace. "Who is he?" Emily asked, referring to the rescued stranger. Jason, who had been examining the man's wallet, replied, "His name is Nathan Fields. According to his ID, he's a professional photographer, specializes in wildlife, judging by the equipment in his backpack." "A nature photographer caught in the storm," Walter murmured. "If it weren't for the wolves—" He didn't finish the sentence, but everyone understood the implication. Without the animal's extraordinary intervention, the man would surely have fallen victim to the relentless cold. As Robert and Jason worked to stabilize Nathan, Emily and Dr. Richard spoke quietly with Walter, occasionally glancing at the three wolves who had settled in a corner of the cabin, attentively observing the human activity. "When Emily told me about this situation, I admit I was skeptical," Dr. Richard confessed. "Maned wolves are notoriously solitary and wary. The idea of three specimens coexisting peacefully with a human, displaying cooperative behaviors among themselves, it seemed like fantasy." "But now you've seen it with your own eyes," Walter replied simply. "Yes, and I'm still trying to process what this means," the specialist said, adjusting his glasses nervously. "The search and rescue behavior they demonstrated today, it goes beyond anything documented for this species. It's almost as if they understood exactly what was happening," Emily finished. "As if they had empathy." Dr. Richard nodded slowly. "The question is, where do we go from here? This is an unprecedented situation, both scientifically and from a conservation standpoint." Walter felt a pang of concern. "What do you mean?" "Well," the specialist began carefully, "on one hand, we have the standard protocol for endangered species documentation, tagging, and monitoring, with eventual release into protected areas. On the other, what we're witnessing here could be invaluable for understanding the species and conservation efforts. Not to mention," Emily added, "these wolves have clearly formed a bond with you, Mr. Walter, and they've just demonstrated rescue capabilities that could literally save lives." At that moment, they were interrupted by Jason, who approached with a relieved expression. "He's responding well to treatment," he reported. "We've managed to raise your body temperature to safer levels. You're starting to regain consciousness." As if to confirm his words, a low moan came from the figure lying near the fireplace. Nathan was moving slightly, his eyes fluttering open and shut as he struggled to come to. Everyone gathered closer, watching anxiously as the man finally opened his eyes, blinking in confusion at the unfamiliar faces surrounding him. "Where?" he began hoarsely. "You're safe," Robert reassured him. "You were found unconscious in the snow. We brought you to Mr. Walter's cabin." Nathan tried to sit up, but Robert gently kept him lying down. "Easy now, you had severe hypothermia. You need to rest." The photographer gave a weak nod, then his eyes suddenly widened as he spotted something beyond the circle of people around. Him. "Wolves!" he exclaimed, trying to scramble back. "It's all right," Walter quickly reassured him. "They won't hurt you. In fact, they're the ones who found you and led us to you." Nathan stared at Walter as if he'd just spoken in an alien tongue. "Wolves have found me?" "Maned wolves," Dr. Richard corrected automatically, And yes, apparently they located you in the snow and guided Mr. Walter to you. One of them even went to fetch additional help. Nathan sank back onto the blanket, looking exhausted and bewildered. I don't understand. It's a long story, Emily said gently. Rest now. We'll have time for explanations later. As the others continued tending to Nathan, Walter stepped away slightly, settling into his rocking chair. He felt strangely drained, not just physically but emotionally. The day's events had been too intense, too extraordinary. The old sage, sensing his withdrawal, rose from his corner and approached silently, lying down at Walter's feet, as he had done so often in recent days. His amber eyes, filled with that impossible intelligence, locked onto Walter's. You knew, didn't you? The old man murmured to the wolf. You knew he was out there, needing help. The wolf didn't answer, of course, but his gaze seemed to hold all the wisdom in the world. Walter reached out and gently touched the animal's head. Thank you, he said simply. Somehow, he felt the old sage understood perfectly. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just getting started. Now, back to the story. The next few hours were filled with intense activity in the small cabin. Nathan, the rescued photographer, was moved to Walter's bed, where he could rest more comfortably. His condition continued to improve gradually, though he remained weak and disoriented. Robert and Jason from the rescue team radioed their base, reporting the successful rescue and requesting further instructions, as the weather still didn't allow for a safe evacuation. Meanwhile, Emily and Dr. Richard carefully observed and documented the behavior of the three maned wolves, who remained surprisingly calm despite the presence of so many strangers in their adopted territory. It's extraordinary, Dr. Richard remarked quietly to Walter as he watched the old sage lying peacefully near the rocking chair. They display a level of sociability that contradicts everything we know about the species. Maned wolves are notoriously solitary, forming only temporary bonds during mating season. Maybe we don't know them as well as we think, Walter suggested. The specialist adjusted his glasses thoughtfully. Or perhaps these ones are truly special, especially the elder. There's something different about him, something I can't quite put my finger on. Emily mentioned her suspicion that he might be some kind of natural hybrid. What would that mean? Asked Walter. Potentially, a lot. Natural hybridization can sometimes result in altered behaviors, unique physical traits, and occasionally even heightened intelligence. Dr. Richard paused. But that doesn't fully explain what we're seeing here. The bond he's formed with you, the way the three of them interact, there's something more going on. Walter looked at the old sage, who seemed to be listening intently to the conversation, his amber eyes shifting between the two men. I think he understands what we're saying, Walter said quietly. Instead of dismissing the idea as fantasy, as Walter expected, Dr. Richard slowly nodded. I'm starting to think the same thing, and that's groundbreaking. Across the cabin, Nathan began stirring again, drawing everyone's attention. Emily approached with a mug of warm broth, helping him sit up slightly. How are you feeling? She asked gently. Like I got hit by a train, Nathan replied weakly with a faint smile. But alive, thanks to you. Thanks to the wolves, actually, Emily corrected. They were the ones who found you. Nathan looked at the three maned wolves with an expression of awe and disbelief. I'm still trying to make sense of it. Why? That's a question we're all asking, said Dr. Richard, stepping closer. I'm Richard Martin, a biologist with the Maned Wolf Project. This situation is well unprecedented. Nathan tried to sit up straighter, his professional interest clearly piqued despite his weakness. I'm a nature photographer, he said. I was trying to document wildlife in the Blue Ridge Mountains during winter, especially the maned wolf, which is rarely photographed this season. I never imagined I'd end up being rescued by them. Do you remember what happened? How you ended up unconscious in the snow? Asked Robert. Nathan frowned, straining to recall. I was following what I thought was a promising trail. Then the blizzard suddenly got worse. I lost my bearings, tried to set up a makeshift shelter, but the cold... He shook his head. After that, I don't remember anything until waking up here. You were lucky, Jason said gravely. A few more hours in those conditions, and we'd have found only a body. A heavy silence fell over the group at those words. Walter glanced at the three wolves who were watching the scene with unusual attentiveness. How did they find me? Nathan finally asked. Why would they care about a human collapsed in the snow? It was the question on everyone's mind, but one for which no one had a satisfying answer. Maybe they no longer see humans as a threat after their experience with Walter, Emily suggested. Or maybe they just care, Walter finished softly. Everyone looked at him, surprised by the simplicity of the answer. What I mean, he continued, is that maybe we're underestimating these animals' ability to feel empathy, to recognize suffering beyond their own kind. It wouldn't be the first time humans underestimated the intelligence and emotions of other creatures. Dr. Richard seemed both skeptical and fascinated by the idea. There are anecdotal reports of altruistic behavior in various species, he admitted. Dolphins supporting injured swimmers, elephants helping other animals in need, but in maned wolves this would be entirely new. Nathan studied the three wolves with a photographer's eye, noting every detail. The oldest one with the bandaged paw, there's something different about him. Not just physically, but in the way he observes, as if constantly evaluating. Yes, I noticed the same, agreed Dr. Richard. There are subtle traits that suggest possible natural hybridization. His ears are less prominent than typical, the skull slightly wider, the coat denser. Hybridization with what? Asked Robert, curious. Hard to say without genetic testing, possibly with some feral domestic dog, or maybe even a grey. Wolf escaped from captivity. Both scenarios are rare but possible. The old sage, as if understanding he was the topic of conversation, stood and walked slowly to the center of the cabin, stopping at a respectful distance from Nathan. His amber eyes studied the rescued man intently, with what seemed like genuine concern. Nathan, despite his weakness, hesitantly reached a hand toward the wolf, stopping short of touching him. "May I?" he asked, looking at Walter. "If he allows it," replied the old man. "He'll decide." To everyone's surprise, except perhaps Walter's, the old sage stepped forward and gently touched Nathan's outstretched hand with his muzzle, allowing the photographer to lightly stroke his head. "Amazing," murmured Nathan. "In 15 years photographing wildlife, I've never experienced anything like this." Dr. Richard quickly documented the interaction with his camera, his expression a mix of scientific wonder and personal admiration. "What do we do now?" asked Emily, looking out the window where snow continued to fall. "Clearly we can't move Nathan today, and we also need to decide about the wolves." Robert, who had been in intermittent contact with his base, replied, "According to the latest weather forecast, we'll have a window of clear skies tomorrow morning. We can arrange an evacuation for Nathan then if he's stable enough." "And the wolves?" asked Walter, concern evident in his voice. Dr. Richard exchanged a glance with Emily before answering, "It's a complicated situation, Mr. Thompson. On one hand, they're wild animals of an endangered species, ideally meant to be in their natural habitat. On the other, they've displayed extraordinary behaviors that warrant further study. Not to mention," added Emily, "they've clearly formed a bond with you, and today they proved capable of locating and helping rescue people in danger." "What are you suggesting?" asked Walter cautiously. Dr. Richard took a deep breath. "I'd like to propose an unconventional solution. A special program under the supervision of the Manned Wolf Project, allowing the wolves to stay here with you as a kind of monitored natural sanctuary. We'd install non-invasive scientific equipment to study their behavior, and you'd be officially designated as a project collaborator." Walter looked at the three wolves who seemed to be following the conversation with uncanny attention. "And they'd have freedom?" he asked. "To come and go as they please?" "Absolutely," confirmed the expert. "The idea isn't to confine them, but to observe and learn. We'd only use minimally invasive trackers to monitor their movements when out of sight." Walter pondered the proposal for a moment, then looked at the old sage as if seeking his opinion. The wolf held his gaze with that impossible intelligence in his amber eyes. "I agree," Walter said finally. "As long as it's clear they're not mine nor the project's, They're their own masters. Dr. Richard smiled. An important and correct distinction, Mr. Thompson. In this unusual partnership, they set the terms, not us. Emily seemed thrilled with the resolution. This is wonderful. We could scientifically document this extraordinary situation, learn more about social behavior and intelligence in manned wolves, and potentially even develop new conservation methods based on what we learn here. Nathan, who had listened to the entire conversation with growing interest, interjected, "If I may, I'd love to contribute to this project. As a wildlife photographer, I could visually document their behavior, creating a record that would complement the scientific data." "That would be a valuable addition," Dr. Richard agreed enthusiastically. "High-quality images are essential for scientific publications and conservation outreach materials." Robert glanced out the window, assessing the weather. "If we decide to go this route, we'll need to coordinate with environmental authorities. I have some contacts who could help expedite the bureaucratic process." As the humans discussed the practical details of the plan, Walter watched in fascination as the three wolves seemed to visibly relax, as if understanding their future had been decided favorably. The old sage returned to his spot at the foot of the rocking chair, while Watcher and Swift settled near the fireplace, their bodies pressed together in a display of comfort and trust. "They understand," Walter murmured to himself. "Somehow they really do." Night fell over the small mountain cabin. Outside, the snow continued to drift down softly, blanketing the world in a quiet white shroud. Inside, the fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the wooden walls. Nathan had finally fallen into a deep, restorative sleep, his exhausted body recovering from the trauma of hypothermia. Robert and Jason took turns monitoring his condition, though it was clear the worst had passed. Emily and Dr. Richard had improvised sleeping spaces on the cabin floor, bundled in sleeping bags and extra blankets Walter kept stored away. Both were asleep now, worn out by the intense events of the day. Only Walter remained awake, sitting in his rocking chair, watching the fire slowly die in the hearth. Beside him, the old sage was also alert, his amber eyes reflecting the orange flames, creating the illusion of fire within them. "You changed everything," Walter whispered to the wolf, his voice barely audible in the quiet of the night. "My life, my cabin, everything." The old sage looked at him, those intelligent eyes seeming to fully grasp the weight of his words. "For 7 years I lived here alone," Walter continued, "trying to forget, trying to disappear from the world. And then you show. Up at my door, bringing your companions, bringing Emily, Dr. Richard, even a photographer lost in the snow." He paused, looking around the cabin at the sleeping figures, at the other 2 wolves now resting near the fireplace. "You brought the world back to me, didn't you?" he asked softly. The old sage lifted his head, his gaze locked onto Walter's with an intensity that seemed to transcend the barriers between species. Then, in a gesture that felt impossible for a wild animal, the wolf gently placed a paw on Walter's wrinkled hand, resting on the arm of the chair. The contact lasted only a moment, but it was enough. Something passed between them in that instant, an understanding, an agreement, a silent promise. Walter felt warm tears streaming down his weathered cheeks, the first he had allowed since the day he buried his family. They weren't just tears of sorrow, but also of a strange kind of gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered to the wolf. The old sage lowered his head and closed his eyes, as if to say, "You're welcome," then settled down to sleep at the foot of the rocking chair. Walter remained awake a little longer, watching the last embers in the fireplace, feeling a warmth. That came not just from the fire, but from within. For the first time in 7 long years, he didn't feel alone. Outside, the snow continued to fall gently, but inside the small mountain cabin, something had bloomed in the frozen heart of winter, something no cold could touch. The next morning brought a surprisingly clear sky, the storm finally giving way to reveal a world transformed into crystal and light. The rays of the rising sun reflected off the pristine snow, creating a spectacle of golden and white sparkles that streamed through the cabin windows. Nathan was considerably better, able to sit up and eat a hearty breakfast Walter had prepared for everyone. His color had returned, and though he was still weak, The signs of hypothermia had nearly vanished. "This is our window," Robert announced after checking his radio. "The rescue helicopter can reach us in about an hour if we leave now." The news was met with mixed feelings. On one hand, everyone was relieved Nathan could receive more thorough medical care. On the other, there was a strange reluctance to break the bubble that had formed in the small cabin, that unlikely encounter between species that felt magical in its uniqueness. "We don't all have to leave," said Dr. Richard. "I can stay to begin documenting the project if Mr. Walter allows." "And I'd like to stay too," Emily added quickly. "There's so much to observe, to record." Walter nodded, feeling an odd sense of relief. "The cabin's small, but there's room for you." Nathan seemed torn. "I'd give anything to stay and document this photographically," he said with obvious frustration, "but I suppose I need to be checked over properly." "Your health comes first," Robert said firmly. "Besides, if this project moves forward as planned, there'll be plenty of chances for you to come back and photograph these extraordinary animals." As they prepared for departure, the three maned wolves watched with keen interest. They seemed to understand something was happening, that changes were coming. When it was finally time for Nathan to leave, accompanied by Robert and Jason, something unexpected happened. The old sage, who usually kept his distance from strangers, approached Nathan and, to everyone's astonishment, gently touched the photographer's arm with his muzzle. "He's saying goodbye," Emily murmured in awe. Nathan, visibly moved, softly stroked the wolf's head. "Thank you for saving my life," he said simply. "I'll come back to photograph you, I promise." The old sage held his gaze for a moment, then stepped back, returning to Walter's side. The departure was quick after that. Robert and Jason helped Nathan walk outside, beginning the arduous journey to the extraction point where the helicopter could land. The last words heard were Robert's. "We'll be back in 2 days with the equipment needed to officially start the project. Take care, Mr. Walter, and take care of your extraordinary friends." With the rescue group gone, the cabin suddenly felt larger and quieter, despite Emily and Dr. Richard's presence. The three wolves moved restlessly around the space, as if sensing the shift in the atmosphere. "They seem unsettled," Emily remarked, watching as the watcher paced back and forth near the window. "I think they feel the change," Walter replied. "So many people coming and going, so many new voices." Dr. Richard, who was organizing his scientific equipment on the small wooden table, looked up. "That makes sense. Wild animals are extremely sensitive to changes in their environment. And considering the level of awareness these three have shown..." He didn't finish the sentence, but it wasn't necessary. Everyone in the cabin had witnessed the extraordinary intelligence and empathy of the maned wolves, especially the old sage. Walter walked to the door and opened it, letting in the cold morning air. "Do you want to go out?" he asked the wolves, as if speaking to people. "You're free to leave if you wish." The three wolves looked at the open door, then at Walter. The old sage was the first to move, slowly approaching the entrance. For a moment, Walter felt a tightness in his chest, thinking the wolf might simply walk away now that the weather had improved. But to his relief and amazement, the old sage only looked outside, sniffed the icy air, and then turned back inside, calmly, settling near the fireplace. Watcher and Swift followed his lead, though Swift lingered longer at the doorway, clearly tempted by the wide, white world outside. "They're choosing to stay," Emily murmured, her voice full of wonder, "even with the door open and the good weather." "That's extraordinary," said Dr. Richard, abandoning his equipment organization to watch the scene. "Wild animals deliberately choosing human company when they have complete freedom to leave." Walter simply nodded, a lump of emotion in his throat keeping him from speaking. He closed the door and returned to his rocking chair, feeling strangely validated. The wolves weren't there just out of necessity or convenience. They were there by choice. The following days established a new routine in the cabin. Emily and Dr. Richard began their scientific documentation, setting up small, non-invasive cameras in strategic corners to record the wolves' behavior. Dr. Richard also performed basic examinations on the three animals, always with extreme care and respect for their space. The old sage is roughly 5 years old as far as I can estimate. he reported after examining the older wolf's teeth and physical traits. Watcher and Swift are younger, maybe 2.5. They could easily be from the same litter. What about the hybridization theory? Emily asked, meticulously taking notes. Dr. Richard adjusted his glasses, thoughtful. There are definitely atypical features in the old sage. The skull structure, fur density, ear shape, all suggest some genetic mixing. But we'd need DNA analysis to confirm it. Would you have to sedate him to collect samples? Walter asked, concerned. Not necessarily, the specialist replied. Given the level of trust he shows in you, we might be able to collect saliva or fur samples without significant stress, but we won't do anything without your consent, Mr. Thompson. You've become their guardian, in a way. Walter shook his head. I'm not their guardian. We're companions, maybe. They chose to be here just like I did. Emily smiled at his answer. That's a beautiful way to see the relationship, she said, and probably more accurate than our traditional scientific categories would allow. On a particularly clear morning, as Walter prepared coffee for everyone, Swift appeared at the cabin door, scratching lightly to be let out. She probably wants to hunt, Emily remarked, having learned to interpret the wolf's behavior. She's been doing this almost daily at the same time. Walter opened the door, and Swift darted out, disappearing into the white landscape with graceful, efficient movements. What surprised everyone, however, was that Watcher, who usually stayed inside when Swift went hunting, followed her this time. That's new, Dr. Richard commented. Richard, who quickly jotted down a note in his notebook. They're adapting their behaviors, possibly developing new cooperative hunting strategies. Only the old sage remained in the cabin, lying near Walter's rocking chair, his once injured paw now almost fully healed thanks to the old man's attentive care. Aren't you going with them? Walter asked the wolf, almost expecting a verbal reply. The old sage simply looked at him with those intense amber eyes which seemed to hold all the wisdom in the world, and rested his head between his front paws, clearly choosing to stay. I think he prefers your company to hunting today, Emily remarked with a smile. The hours passed quietly. Emily and Dr. Richard worked on their records and analyses, occasionally discussing theories about the wolves' unusual behavior. Walter busied himself with simple chores, chopping firewood stored in the small shed attached to the cabin, preparing a hearty soup for lunch, organizing his medicinal herbs, which had been somewhat neglected since the arrival of their visitors, both human and canine. It was mid-afternoon as the sun began its descent toward the horizon when Watcher and Swift returned, but they weren't alone. Walter was the first to notice, glancing out the window upon hearing the familiar sound of their paws in the snow. They've brought something, he said, furrowing his brow as he tried to make out what he was seeing. Emily and Dr. Richard hurried to the window, peering over Walter's shoulders. Good heavens, Emily murmured, it's a pup. And indeed it was. Between Watcher and Swift, hesitantly trudging through the deep snow, was a young maned wolf, visibly smaller than the other. Two, its fur still bearing the darker coloration typical of juveniles. Walter opened the door, allowing the three to enter. The pup hesitated at the threshold, clearly uneasy about the unfamiliar surroundings and the presence of humans. But Swift gently nudged it forward with her muzzle, guiding it inside. Unbelievable, Dr. Richard whispered, standing perfectly still so as not to startle the newcomer. They found a pup and deliberately brought it here. The old sage, who had been lying near the fireplace, rose immediately upon seeing the pup. Moving slowly and gently, he approached the small animal, sniffing it carefully. The pup shrank back at first, but soon relaxed under the older wolf's inspection. It looks to be about 4 or 5 months old, Dr. Richard estimated, watching closely. Too young to be alone in the wild, it must have gotten separated from its mother somehow. Emily had already grabbed her notebook, furiously documenting the extraordinary interaction unfolding before them. Look at how Swift is behaving, she whispered, almost maternally. It was true, Swift had lain down near the pup, letting it snuggle against her for warmth. Watcher stood close by in a protective stance, his eyes shifting between the pup and the humans, as if assessing whether they posed any threat. They've adopted it, Walter murmured, awestruck. They found it out there alone and brought it to safety. Dr. Richard nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving the remarkable scene. Intergenerational adoption behavior in unrelated adult man. Wolves! This has never been documented before. It's groundbreaking. Walter looked at the old sage, who now watched the other 3 wolves with what could only be described as satisfaction. When their eyes met, Walter felt something pass between them, an understanding, an acknowledgement. "They're forming a family," he said softly, "just like us." Emily looked at Walter, understanding the depth of his words. The lonely old man, who had lost his family so long ago, the scientists who had found something far beyond what they expected in their research, and the maned wolves, supposedly solitary creatures, who were defying everything known about their species by forming unlikely family bonds. "Yes," she agreed, her voice thick with emotion, "a most unusual family." Dr. Richard cleared his throat, visibly moved but trying to maintain a professional demeanor. "The pup is probably hungry," he said practically, "and possibly dehydrated. We should offer water and maybe some soft meat." Walter was already moving toward the kitchen, where leftovers from the rabbit Swift had brought the day before remained. He cut the meat into small pieces and placed them on a shallow dish, along with a bowl of fresh water. With slow, deliberate movements, he approached the group of wolves and set the offerings on the ground at a respectful distance. Then he stepped back, giving them space. Swift seemed to understand perfectly. Gently, she nudged the pup toward the food with her nose. The little one hesitated at first, but hunger soon overcame fear. He approached the dish and began eating voraciously, pausing occasionally to glance around as if still unable to believe his luck. "He must have been alone out there for days," Dr. Richard remarked. "It's a miracle he survived the cold." "It's a miracle he was found," Emily added, "and even more extraordinary that he was brought here. How did they know he'd be safe here? Why did they decide to take him in?" "Maybe for the same reasons humans adopt," Walter suggested simply. "Compassion. The need to care. The desire for family." Dr. Richard seemed ready to argue against such a humanizing explanation, but faced with the scene before him, 3 adult maned wolves collectively caring for an orphaned pup, clearly displaying family behavior, traditional scientific explanations, felt inadequate. "You may be right," he admitted finally. "Perhaps we're only just beginning to glimpse the emotional complexity of other species." As night fell, the pup, now fed and seemingly more relaxed, began timidly exploring his new surroundings. Under the watchful eyes of Swift and Watcher, he sniffed around the cabin, occasionally glancing at the humans with a mix of curiosity and caution. The old sage stayed slightly apart, like a patriarch observing his growing family. His amber eyes followed the pup's movements with what looked like pride. "We should name the little one," Emily said, smiling as she watched the pup clumsily trying to climb onto the wooden bench. "Courage," Walter suggested after a moment's thought, "because it took great courage to survive alone out there, and even more to trust strangers." Emily and Dr. Richard exchanged glances, then nodded in agreement. "Courage it is then," Dr. Richard agreed, making a note in his book. "A fitting name for the newest member of this extraordinary family." That night, as everyone finally settled to sleep, the 4 wolves curled up together near the fireplace, their bodies forming a protective circle around the pup. Watching them from his bed, Walter felt a long-forgotten warmth in his chest, the feeling of being part of something greater than himself, of belonging. "Good night, family," he murmured softly before drifting off. The next morning, the cabin was awakened by the lively sounds of the pup, who seemed to have overcome much of his initial shyness and now ran back and forth, occasionally nipping at Watcher's paws, who tolerated the play with surprising patience. "It's extraordinary how quickly he's adapted," remarked Emily, watching the scene as she sipped her coffee. "In less than 12 hours, he's already acting like he's always been here." "Young ones of all species have that ability to adapt," replied Walter, a faint smile on his weathered face. "It's one of the blessings of youth." Dr. Richard, who was reviewing the footage from the overnight cameras, made a surprised sound. "You need to see this," he called, turning his laptop screen so the others could look. The nighttime infrared images clearly showed Old Sage awake in the middle of the night while the others slept. The older wolf had gotten up and carefully adjusted the pup's position after he had strayed from the warmth of the group, gently pulling him back into the center of the protective circle. He was making sure the pup didn't get cold, Emily murmured, amazed. It's classic parental behavior, confirmed Dr. Richard, but in an adult maned wolf unrelated to the pup, it's unprecedented. Walter watched the footage with a lump in his throat. There was something deeply moving about Old Sage's kindness, his quiet care in the night. He knows what it's like to lose a family, Walter said softly. Just like I do. Emily and Dr. Richard looked at him, surprised by the personal admission. You feel he understands your story? Emily asked carefully. Walter nodded slowly. From the first moment our eyes met, I felt it. A recognition, like he could see right through me, straight to the pain I carry. Dr. Richard seemed to want to say something, perhaps a scientific explanation, maybe a warning against excessive anthropomorphizing, but held back. He had witnessed too much in recent days that defied conventional explanations. Interspecies communication is still a poorly understood field, he said finally, diplomatic, especially when it involves complex emotions. But what we're seeing here, well, it's pushing the boundaries of what we thought was possible. Just then, the radio left by Robert crackled to life with a high-pitched tone, signaling an incoming transmission. Emily quickly grabbed it and adjusted the frequency. This is Emily Parker, at Mr. Walter Thompson's cabin. Over. Robert's voice crackled through the device. Emily, this is Robert. We're on our way with the equipment and preliminary permits. We're also bringing Nathan, the photographer. He insisted on returning as soon as he was medically cleared. We should arrive in about 3 hours. Over. Understood, Robert. There are developments here you need to know about. The wolves have found and adopted an orphaned pup. We now have 4 manned wolves in the cabin. Over. There was a long silence before Robert's voice returned, clearly stunned. A pup? They deliberately brought an orphaned pup into the cabin? Over. Affirmative, and they're demonstrating coordinated parental behavior. It's absolutely extraordinary. Over. We're speeding up our arrival. This is... I'm at a loss for words. Over and out. Emily turned off the radio, her face alight with scientific excitement. They won't believe it until they see it with their own eyes, she said, even after everything they've already witnessed. Dr. Richard nodded, still staring at the footage of Old Sage tending to the pup in the night. We're documenting behaviors that completely redefine our understanding of this species, he said. Perhaps of many species. The implications for conservation, animal behavior, even for our understanding of intelligence and emotion in other species. He didn't finish the sentence, but it wasn't necessary. Everyone in the cabin understood the magnitude of what they were witnessing. The next 3 hours were spent preparing for the group's arrival. Walter, accustomed to his solitude, felt strangely nervous at the prospect of so many people in his cabin. But there was also an undeniable excitement in the air, a sense that they were on the brink of something important. The Old Sage, always attuned to Walter's emotions, stayed close to him all morning, like a comforting presence. The other wolves, including the pup, seemed to sense the excitement, moving around the cabin with energy and anticipation. When they finally heard the sound of approaching vehicles, the unmistakable roar of engines breaking the mountain silence, Walter went to the window, the Old Sage by his side. More visitors coming, he said to the wolf, who looked at him with those inscrutable amber eyes. Our quiet life is definitely changing, my friend. The Old Sage tilted his head slightly, in a gesture that seemed like understanding. Then, to Walter's surprise, the wolf briefly pressed his head against the old man's leg, before moving away to join the other wolves near the fireplace. It was as if to say, "We're in this together." Walter felt a lump in his throat as he opened the door to greet the newcomers. His life had been completely transformed in just a few days, from a solitary hermit to a member of an unlikely family at the center of a major scientific discovery. And it had all started with 3 wolves freezing on his doorstep, seeking shelter on a stormy night. When Robert, Nathan, and the rest of the team entered the cabin, bringing equipment, supplies, and the energy of the outside world, they were met with an extraordinary sight. 4 manned wolves and 3 humans peacefully sharing The same space, an impossible harmony between species that would normally keep their distance. "Welcome," Walter said simply, feeling the old sage position himself beside him like a silent co-host. "Welcome to our family." Robert, the rescue team coordinator, stood stunned as he entered the cabin and took in the unbelievable scene. The four-manned wolves, including the small pup who now half hid behind Swift, watched the newcomers with varying degrees of caution and curiosity. "It's even more extraordinary than I imagined," he murmured, strategically staying near the entrance. Careful not to startle the animals, Nathan, the rescued photographer, wore an expression of pure wonder. Though he still looked pale and a bit weak from his ordeal, his eyes shone with professional fascination. "The greatest photographic opportunity of my career," he said softly, almost reverently, "and to think I almost missed it by freezing out in the snow." With them were two more team members Walter didn't know. A middle-aged woman with steel-grey hair pulled into a severe bun, and a young man carrying what looked like sophisticated scientific equipment. "This is Dr. Barbara Anderson from the Department of Environmental Protection," Robert introduced. "She's here to formalize the project and ensure all wildlife protection regulations are followed. And this is Luke, our monitoring equipment technician. He'll set up more advanced systems to document the wolves' behavior." Dr. Barbara stepped forward, her gaze critically assessing the surroundings and the animals. There was something in her bearing that conveyed authority and scientific skepticism. "Mr. Thompson," she greeted formally, "this is an unprecedented situation. We'll need to document everything meticulously and establish clear protocols to ensure the animals' well-being and the study's integrity." Her tone was professional, almost distant, but her eyes betrayed genuine astonishment as she observed the wolves, especially when she noticed the partially hidden pup. "A juvenile?" she asked, turning to Dr. Richard. "Found yesterday," he confirmed, enthusiastically. "Watcher and Swift brought him to the cabin. They're showing coordinated parental behavior. It's extraordinary." Dr. Barbara adjusted her glasses, visibly processing the information. "Adoptive behavior in adult manned wolves. That's never been scientifically documented. Are you certain it's not their own pup?" "Absolutely certain," replied Dr. Richard. "The age difference between the adults and the pup is inconsistent with direct kinship. Plus, look at the coloring and physical traits. He's not genetically related to either adult." The scientists seemed both skeptical and fascinated. "We'll need genetic tests to confirm, of course." As the newcomers settled in, Walter noticed that the old sage was watching Dr. Barbara intently. The older wolf appeared to be assessing her, his amber eyes fixed on her with unusual intensity. Slowly, to everyone's astonishment, the old sage approached the scientist, who froze in place, clearly not expecting a direct approach from a wild animal. "Don't move," Dr. Richard instructed quietly. "He's just acknowledging your presence. It's a social evaluation behavior." Dr. Barbara remained perfectly still as the old sage circled her, occasionally sniffing but always keeping a respectful distance. Finally, the wolf stopped directly in front of her, sat back on his hind legs, and looked straight into the scientist's eyes. It was a moment charged with tension and meaning. Everyone in the cabin watched, barely breathing, this interspecies encounter, the rational scientist and the wild wolf sizing each other up. Then something extraordinary happened. The old sage tilted his head slightly in a gesture that seemed almost respectful. Then he turned and returned to his spot near Walter. Dr. Barbara let out the breath she'd unconsciously been holding. "In 30 years of studying wild animals," she murmured, her voice slightly shaky, "I've never experienced anything like this." "He accepted you," Walter said simply. "Now you can stay." The bluntness of the statement caused a slight tension in the room. Dr. Barbara raised her eyebrows, clearly unaccustomed to having her authority questioned, especially by a civilian without scientific credentials. "Mr. Thompson, technically, these are wild animals belonging to a protected species. The decision about who can stay lies with the environmental authorities I represent." Before the situation could escalate, Emily interjected diplomatically, "I believe what Mr. Walter meant is that the old sage, who's shown a leadership role among the wolves, seems to have accepted your presence. That will make our work much easier, since they appear to follow his suggestions, so to speak." The explanation seemed to satisfy Dr. Barbara, who nodded stiffly. Well, let's get down to business then. I've brought preliminary permits from the EPA Wildlife Division for the study. We'll need to establish clear protocols, define roles and responsibilities, and ensure the research follows all ethical standards. As the scientists and officials gathered around Walter's small table to discuss formalities, Nathan discreetly approached the older man. "Mr. Walter," he said quietly, "I wanted to properly thank you for everything you and your friends have done for me. You literally saved my life." Walter waved a dismissive hand. "It wasn't me. It was them," he said, indicating the wolves with a tilt of his head. "I just followed where they led me." Nathan looked at the wolves with clear admiration. "Even so, I'd like to offer something in return. I'm a professional photographer, as you probably know, specializing in wildlife. If you'll allow me, I'd like to document this extraordinary story, not just for science, but for you too, so you have a record of this unique moment in your life." The offer moved Walter deeply. In his 7 years of voluntary isolation, he had deliberately avoided photographs, keepsakes, anything that might stir memories of his former life. But now, faced with this unlikely new family that had entered his world, he felt a sudden urge to preserve, to remember. "I'd like that," he said simply. "Thank you." Across the cabin, the pup, who had been hiding behind Swift since the visitors arrived, now ventured on small exploratory trips, his youthful curiosity slowly overcoming his initial fear. Watcher stayed close, attentive to the little ones, every move, ready to step in at the slightest sign of danger. Dr. Barbara, despite her initially rigid demeanor, couldn't hide her fascination as she observed the wolves' interactions. "The social structure they're displaying," she murmured to Dr. Richard. "It's more reminiscent of grey wolves than maned wolves. Division of responsibilities, cooperative care for the pup." "Exactly," Dr. Richard agreed enthusiastically. "And there's more. We've seen behavior suggesting deliberate communication, coordinated decision-making, even what appears to be knowledge being passed down from the old sage to the younger ones." The scientist quickly typed notes into her tablet. "We'll need controlled studies, systematic observations, possibly even functional MRIs if we can get portable equipment." "With all due respect, Doctor," Walter interrupted, having approached the group quietly, "they're not lab specimens, they're living beings with their own choices." Dr. Barbara seemed about to argue when the old sage, as if perfectly understanding the conversation, positioned himself beside Walter, his presence a silent declaration of alliance. The scientist looked from Walter's determined eyes to the wolf's intense amber gaze, and something in her expression softened. "You're right, Mr. Thompson," she finally admitted. "We need to balance scientific needs with respect for these extraordinary animals. Any protocol we establish must prioritize their well-being and autonomy." It was the beginning of a delicate compromise, a careful dance between scientific curiosity and respect for the creatures they were studying. Over the next few hours, as plans were made and equipment set up, one thing became clear to everyone present. What was happening in that remote mountain cabin wasn't just a scientific study. It was a transformative encounter between species, a redefinition of what it meant to be family. And at the center of it all was Walter Thompson, a man who had fled the world after losing everything, only to find, in the most unlikely of circumstances, a new sense of belonging. The following weeks brought significant changes to the small mountain cabin. With official approval from the EPA Wildlife Division and support from the Manned Wolf Project, Walter's simple home gradually transformed into an improvised research station, though everyone involved took care to keep the environment as natural and comfortable as possible for the wolves. Luke, the technician, installed discrete cameras in strategic points inside and around the cabin, as well as motion sensors in the surrounding area that would allow monitoring the activities of the manned wolves when they ventured out to explore. Small, lightweight, and minimally invasive trackers were placed on special collars for the 4 wolves after a careful habituation process that respected each animal's pace. The old sage, surprisingly, was the first to accept the device, almost as if he understood its scientific purpose. Swift and Watcher followed his lead with some initial hesitation. Little Courage, as expected, turned the process into a game, trying to nibble on the equipment, while Dr. Richard adjusted it. Life in the cabin settled into a new rhythm. In the mornings, the wolves usually went out to explore the surrounding territory, often led by Swift, whose hunting skills were crucial for the group's survival. Watcher had taken on the role of the pup's protector, patiently teaching him basic survival skills through structured play that the scientists documented with fascination. The old sage alternated between joining the group and staying at the cabin with Walter. The bond between the elderly man and the oldest wolf continued to deepen, transcending species barriers in ways that both amazed and puzzled the scientists. "They truly seem to communicate on a level beyond what we can measure," Emily remarked, as she reviewed footage of Walter and the old sage sitting together on the cabin porch, watching the sunset in shared silence. "There are recent studies on synchronized brainwaves between humans and dogs with strong bonds," replied Dr. Richard. "But this is different. It's as if they share a secret vocabulary no one else understands." Dr. Barbara, who had initially been the voice of scientific caution and skepticism, had gradually become one of the project's most passionate advocates. The evidence of the wolves' extraordinary behavior was simply undeniable. "The communication patterns we're observing," she explained during a video conference with the scientific committee in Washington, D.C., "suggest not only advanced social intelligence, but also a capacity for cultural adaptation that challenges our traditional models of animal behavior." Nathan, the photographer, spent his days meticulously documenting every aspect of the wolves' interactions, both among themselves and with the humans. His photos, capturing moments of tenderness, communication, and cross-species companionship, were beginning to draw attention from the global scientific community. One particularly sunny afternoon, about a month after the project officially began, the team gathered to discuss preliminary findings. Walter's small table was covered in papers, charts, and reports as the scientists shared their observations. "The tracking data shows something fascinating," Luke said, displaying a digital map on his laptop. "The wolves are establishing a territory much larger than usual for their species, yet they always return to the cabin. It's as if they consider it their central point, their home." "The cooperative behavior continues to evolve," Emily added. "Yesterday we observed Swift and Watcher hunting in perfect coordination, using techniques we'd typically only see in social hunting species like gray wolves or lions. And the pup is thriving," Dr. Richard pointed out, showing growth charts. "His development curve is even above the expected range for the species. The shared care he's receiving appears to have a significant positive impact." Walter listened to the scientific discussions with quiet attention, occasionally contributing observations based on his daily life with the manned wolves. The old sage, as always, remained close to him, seemingly following the conversation with those inscrutable amber eyes. "There's something I've noticed," Walter said during a lull in the discussion. "The old sage seems to be teaching the others, not just survival skills, but almost like values." The statement drew curious looks from the scientists. "What do you mean, values?" asked Dr. Barbara Anderson, intrigued. "Yesterday, for example," Walter explained, "Watcher had caught a small mouse and seemed to be playing with it, letting it run only to catch it again. The old sage stepped in, made a low sound, and Watcher immediately killed the mouse quickly, as if he'd been corrected for causing unnecessary suffering." A thoughtful silence fell over the group. "That would be..." Dr. Richard Martin seemed to be choosing his words carefully. "Rudimentary ethical behavior, transmission of social norms. Or it could simply be an energy conservation instinct," countered Dr. Barbara, ever the voice of scientific caution. "Playing with prey wastes unnecessary energy." "It wasn't that," Walter insisted gently. "I've known this wolf long enough to recognize when he's disapproving of something." The discussion was interrupted by the sound of the door opening. Swift, Watcher, and Little Courage returned from their morning excursion. The pup, now noticeably larger than when he'd first arrived, immediately ran to the old sage, touching his nose to the older wolves in a gesture that seemed almost like a greeting. The ritualization of social behaviors among them continues to evolve, Emily remarked, jotting down quick notes. "They're developing their own family culture." The observation perfectly captured what was happening in that cabin. A culture was emerging there, a way of being that transcended traditional boundaries between species. This wasn't just a group of wolves adapting to human presence, nor humans passively studying wild animals. It was something new, something unfolding. Night had already fallen when the team finally wrapped up the meeting. Dr. Barbara, Dr. Richard, and Luke retreated to the small annex built beside the main cabin to house the researchers. Emily, who usually slept there as well, decided to stay a little longer, reviewing notes by the firelight. Walter was making tea in the small kitchen when he noticed the old sage staring intently out the window, ears pricked, body tense. "What is it?" he asked, immediately alert. He had learned to trust the wolf's instincts. The old sage turned to him, then back to the window, a clear attempt at communication. Something outside had caught his attention. "Emily," Walter called softly, "I think we've got a situation." The scientist quickly approached, sensing the tension. "What's happening?" "I don't know, but he senses something out there." The other three wolves were alert now too, Watcher and Swift positioning themselves protectively near the pup. The old sage went to the door and scratched lightly, looking back at Walter. "He wants to go out," Emily said. "Or he wants you to go with him." Walter didn't hesitate. He grabbed his heavy coat and a flashlight. "I'll see what it is. You stay here and alert the others if needed." "You shouldn't go alone," Emily protested. "I won't be alone," Walter replied, nodding toward the old sage. When he opened the door, the icy mountain night air hit him. The moon was nearly full, casting an ethereal silver glow over the snowy landscape. The old sage stepped out immediately, pausing a few yards ahead to make sure Walter followed. Together, man and wolf moved through the night, leaving behind the safety of the cabin's lights. The silence was nearly absolute, broken only by the sound of their footsteps on the packed snow and their visible breaths in the cold air. After about 10 minutes of walking, the old sage stopped abruptly, his body tense, his muzzle pointed toward a small valley ahead. Walter strained his eyes, trying to make out what had caught the wolf's attention. Then he heard it, the distinct sound of an engine. And he saw lights moving among the trees in the valley below. "Vehicles," he murmured. "Who would be driving in this remote area in the middle of the night?" The old sage let out a low sound, almost a grunt. Clearly, whoever it was, the wolf didn't consider them friendly. Carefully, Walter and the old sage moved closer, keeping hidden under the cover of the trees. As they advanced, Walter could make out the scene in the valley more clearly. There were 2 all-terrain vehicles, and around them moved human figures. He counted 4, equipped with flashlights and what looked like rifles. "Poachers," Walter whispered, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the outside temperature. Hunting in this region was strictly forbidden, especially at night. Whoever they were here illegally. The old sage tensed even more beside him, a low, continuous growl rumbling from his throat. Walter placed a calming hand on the animal's back. "We have to go back and warn the others," he murmured. "We need to contact the authorities." But as they prepared to retreat, Walter saw something that froze his blood. One of the poachers was holding something up in the air, illuminated by a flashlight. It was unmistakably the carcass of a young maned wolf. The old sage saw it too. His whole body trembled with what seemed like a mix of fury and grief. Walter felt the wolf's fur bristle under his hand. "No," he urged, gripping the wolf more firmly. "We can't confront them. There are too many and they're armed." For a terrible moment, Walter feared the old sage would ignore him and charge at the poachers, a decision that would surely be fatal. But something in his voice, or perhaps the pressure of his hand, seemed to reach the animal. The old sage looked at him, his amber eyes glowing in the moonlight, filled with emotion. Then, in an extraordinary display of self-control, the wolf slowly stepped back. Together they hurried back to the cabin, where Emily was waiting anxiously at the door. "What happened?" she asked, immediately noticing the tension in both of them. "Illegal poachers," Walter explained quickly, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. "At least 4 armed, and they've—" He hesitated, glancing at the other wolves, especially the pup. "They killed a young maned wolf." Emily paled. "Oh my God, we need to alert the team and call the environmental authorities." As Emily rushed to the annex to wake the others, Walter noticed the old sage communicating intensely with Watcher and Swift. The three adult wolves exchanged glances and soft sounds, engaged in a silent conversation that seemed charged with urgency. "What are you planning?" Walter asked, suddenly uneasy. In response, Watcher went to the door and began scratching, lightly, looking back at the old sage as if asking for permission. "No," Walter said firmly. "It's too dangerous out there now. They have guns." The old sage stepped closer to Walter and locked eyes with him. There was so much intelligence, so much purpose in those amber eyes, that Walter could almost hear the unspoken words, "We must protect our territory, our family." The annex door opened and Dr. Richard, Dr. Barbara and Luke hurried in, followed by Emily, all in various states of disarray, roused from their sleep. "Illegal poachers?" asked Dr. Barbara, adjusting her glasses. "Are you sure?" "Absolutely," confirmed Walter. "They were carrying rifles and trophies." Luke was already on the phone, trying to contact the nearest environmental authorities. His expression grew increasingly frustrated. "Not enough signal," he informed. "And the emergency radio is in the jeep. We need to go there to make the call." "In the dark, with armed hunters in the area?" questioned Dr. Richard, clearly disturbed. "It's too risky." Then the unthinkable happened. The old sage walked deliberately to the center of the room, drawing everyone's attention. With slow, deliberate movements, he looked at each human present, then at the door, sending an unmistakable message. "He wants us to follow him," said Emily, awed. "He wants to lead us to where? To the hunters?" Walter studied the maned wolf thoughtfully. "No, to a safe place where we can call for help." Dr. Barbara seemed skeptical. Are we really considering following a wild animal in the middle of the night based on an interpretation of its intentions?" But Dr. Richard was already grabbing his coat. "If there's one thing I've learned these past weeks, it's that underestimating the intelligence of these wolves is always a mistake. If the old sage has a plan, I'm willing to trust him." The decision split the group. Finally, they agreed that Luke and Dr. Richard would follow the old sage to try to establish communication with the authorities, while Walter, Emily, and Dr. Barbara would stay in the cabin with the other wolves, especially to protect the pup. Watcher, however, had other plans. As the old sage, Luke, and Dr. Richard prepared to leave, the younger wolf positioned himself beside them, clearly indicating his intention to join. "Looks like we'll have two guides," remarked Dr. Richard, a mix of nerves and fascination in his voice. "Be extremely careful," Walter instructed. "These men are dangerous, and our wolves are targets for them." The old sage met, his gaze one last time before leaving, and once again Walter felt that inexplicable communication between them. "Trust me," those amber eyes seemed to say. "I do," Walter murmured, so softly only the wolf could hear. And then, in an unlikely formation, two men and two maned wolves disappeared into the night, leaving the others in the cabin with uncertainty and waiting. The next few hours were some of the longest in Walter's memory. He, Emily, and Dr. Barbara remained alert, taking turns watching through the windows while Swift and Little Courage stayed inside the cabin. The pup, sensing the tension in the air, stayed unusually quiet, nestled against Swift as if seeking safety. "This is so frustrating," Dr. Barbara murmured, checking her watch for the 10th time in 15 minutes. "Almost 2 hours with no news." "What worries me most," Emily said, lowering her voice so Walter, who was by the window, wouldn't hear, "is the emotional toll this could take. If something happens to the old sage or Watcher." She didn't finish the sentence, but her glance toward Walter made her concern clear. The old man had grown deeply attached to the wolves, especially the old sage. Losing any of them would be devastating. It was then that they heard it, the distant sound of engines approaching fast. Walter tensed, gripping the stock of the old hunting rifle he'd retrieved from his cabinet. It was an antique he rarely used, but tonight he'd felt the need for some protection. "They're coming this way," he warned, his voice tight. Emily and Dr. Barbara quickly turned off the cabin lights, leaving only the soft glow of the fireplace to illuminate the room. Swift, sensing danger, guided the pup to a darker, more sheltered corner. The roar of engines grew louder, and then headlights swept across the cabin windows. Vehicles were approaching. "Stay down and away from the windows," instructed Walter, moving to a position where he could see without being seen. Through the fogged window, he could make out two all-terrain vehicles stopping just a few yards from the cabin. Human figures stepped out, carrying flashlights and, his heart clenched, weapons. "It's them," Walter whispered to the women, "the hunters." Dr. Barbara Anderson visibly paled, while Emily Parker moved silently toward Swift and the pup, as if she could shield them with her own body. "What do we do?" asked Dr. Anderson, her voice tense. "We wait," Walter replied firmly, "and we defend ourselves if we have to." The vehicle's headlights switched off, plunging the outside area into the silvery darkness of moonlight. Walter could see the men's flashlights moving, drawing closer to the cabin. Their voices reached him indistinctly, harsh words, occasional laughter. Then suddenly a new sound cut through the night. Sirens. Red and blue lights appeared around the bend of the path leading to the cabin, illuminating the scene with flashing bursts. "The Environmental Protection Force!" Emily exclaimed, rushing to the window. It was true. 3 patrol vehicles from the Environmental Protection Force emerged, surrounding the hunters' trucks. Uniformed officers quickly stepped out, weapons drawn, shouting orders at the hunters. The chaos that followed was brief. The hunters, caught off guard, put up little resistance. Within minutes, they were disarmed and handcuffed. "They did it," Walter murmured, relief washing over him. Luke and Richard must have made contact, but where were they? And more importantly, where were the old sage and Watcher? The answer came moments later when a 4th patrol vehicle arrived. From it stepped Luke and Dr. Richard, accompanied by a high-ranking officer from the Environmental Protection Force. And to Walter's immense relief, Watcher emerged from the shadows beside them. But the old sage was nowhere in sight. Walter's heart clenched painfully. He opened the cabin door and ran outside, ignoring the biting cold and Emily's shouts for him to be careful. "Richard," he called, approaching the group. "Where's the old sage?" Dr. Richard turned to him, his face a mask of weary concern. "Walter, he began, but was interrupted by movement in the shadows beyond the patrol car. Slowly, majestically, the old sage emerged from the darkness. He walked deliberately, his posture radiating dignity and purpose, but something was wrong. Even in the dim light, Walter could see a dark stain on his flank. Blood. "He's hurt!" Walter exclaimed, rushing toward the wolf. The old sage met his gaze, and in those amber eyes Walter saw pain but also determination. The wolf didn't stop, continuing his deliberate stride, not toward Walter, but toward the group of handcuffed hunters. The Environmental Protection. Officers, noticing the injured wolf's approach, instinctively moved to intercept him, but the senior officer raised a hand, stopping them. "Let him," he ordered. "I want to see this." The old sage stopped directly in front of the hunters. The men who moments earlier had been defiant and arrogant now looked uneasy under the scrutiny of those piercing amber eyes. It was as if they were being judged by something older and wiser than human laws. The moment stretched heavy with meaning. Then, slowly and deliberately, the old sage turned his back on the hunters and returned to Walter's side. Only when he reached the old man did the wolf allow his composure to falter. His legs trembled, and he would have collapsed if Walter hadn't quickly knelt to support him. "We need a vet, fast!" shouted Walter, watching with growing anguish the blood staining the golden-red fur of the manned wolf. Dr. Richard was already running toward him, carrying the first aid kit he always kept nearby. "It's a grazing wound," he said after a quick examination. "The bullet passed through the muscle tissue on the flank, but doesn't seem to have hit any vital organs. He's lost blood, but with proper treatment." "Then treat him," demanded Walter, his voice breaking with emotion. In the minutes that followed, everyone worked together to stabilize the old sage. The wolf was gently carried into the cabin, where Dr. Richard, assisted by Dr. Barbara and Emily, cleaned and treated the wound under stronger light. Walter stayed by his side the entire time, murmuring words of comfort, his hand never leaving the animal's neck. Swift, Watcher, and Little Courage watched anxiously, staying close but out of the way, as if they understood the seriousness of the situation. "He'll survive," Dr. Richard finally declared, applying the last bandage. "He's an incredibly strong and resilient animal, but he'll need time to fully recover." "And he'll have all the time he needs," Walter said firmly. Outside, the hunters were being taken away, their vehicles confiscated, their weapons and the grim trophies from their illegal hunt seized as evidence. The senior officer from the Environmental Protection Force entered the cabin respectfully, removing his hat when he saw the injured wolf being treated. "Lieutenant Colonel Richards, Federal Environmental Protection Agency," he introduced himself. "Mr. Thompson, Dr. Richard, I've gotten a preliminary explanation from your colleagues, but I admit I'm still trying to understand exactly what happened here tonight." Dr. Richard looked at Walter, then at the old sage, who, despite his weakened state, watched the newcomer with vigilant eyes. "It's a long story, Lieutenant Colonel," Dr. Richard replied, "and one that challenges many of our assumptions about animal intelligence and cross-species relationships. I have time," the officer answered, pulling up a chair, "and after what I witnessed tonight, I'm inclined to believe things I would have once thought impossible." And so as the night wore on and the old sage rested, protected by the circle of his unlikely family, the story was told. The story of a man who had lost everything, of 3 wolves who appeared at his door during a storm, and how together they had rediscovered the meaning of family, home, and belonging. Lieutenant Colonel Richards listened in silence, his face revealing growing astonishment. When the narrative reached the events of that night, how the old sage had led Luke and Dr. Richard through the forest to a point where they could contact the authorities, how Watcher had later guided the police back to the hunters, and how the old sage, even wounded, had insisted on confronting the men who had harmed one of his own, the officer seemed almost speechless. "In 30 years of environmental protection service, I've never seen or heard anything like this," he finally admitted. "The level of deliberate cooperation, the apparent understanding of the situation, the cross-species coordination, it's extraordinary." "It's not just cooperation or intelligence," Walter said softly, his hand still resting on the old sage's neck. "It's connection, family." "Whatever it is," the lieutenant colonel replied, standing up, "I assure you we'll do everything in our power to protect these remarkable animals and this project. The hunters will face the full extent of the law, and I'll request additional protection for this area." When the officer finally left, dawn was already beginning to tinge the horizon with soft shades of pink and gold. The long night of danger had ended. The manned wolves were safe, the hunters had been captured, and a story of courage, loyalty, and interspecies cooperation had been written. Walter, exhausted but deeply relieved, sat on the ground beside the old sage, who now slept peacefully, under the effects of painkillers. The other 3 wolves had settled nearby, forming a protective circle around their wounded leader. Emily approached quietly and sat beside Walter. "You were right, you know," she said softly. "About what?" "About family. About what's happening here being more than a scientific study, more than animal behavior. It's truly a family, forming beyond the boundaries of species." Walter nodded slowly, watching the sunrise through the window. For the first time in a long while, he felt truly at peace. "Family isn't just blood," he said. "It's choice. It's loyalty. It's being there for each other when it matters most." Emily smiled, watching the wolves sleep together, bound by the invisible tie they'd formed. "A definition that transcends species." "Exactly," Walter replied, feeling the warmth of the old sage's body against his leg, a tangible reminder of connection and belonging. "Exactly. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out." Now continuing. In the days following the confrontation with the hunters, a reflective quiet settled over the small cabin in the mountains. The old sage was slowly recovering, his incredible physical constitution helping him overcome the trauma of his injury. He was quieter than usual, spending long periods simply observing the activity in the cabin with those inscrutable amber eyes. Walter rarely left his side, sleeping on the floor near the wounded wolf, making sure he took the medications prescribed by the vet sent by the Environmental Protection Force, and murmuring words of encouragement that somehow seemed understood by the animal. The other 3 wolves also showed clear concern for the old sage. Swift often brought small prey directly to him, gently placing it within reach. Watcher maintained an almost constant vigil, positioning himself near the door or window as if standing guard. And Little Courage, normally so full of youthful energy, had calmed remarkably, often lying beside the older wolf, his small body offering extra warmth. "The family dynamic is evolving in response to the crisis," remarked Dr. Richard, who meticulously documented every behavior. "They're adapting their roles to accommodate the need to care for the injured member. It's extremely advanced behavior for non-domesticated canids." News of the confrontation with the hunters and the wolves' extraordinary intervention spread quickly. Journalists began appearing in the nearest small town, eager for a story about heroic wolves and the solitary man who lived with them. The Environmental Protection Force, true to their promise, set up a protective perimeter around the area, keeping the curious and sensationalists at bay. Nathan, the photographer, inadvertently became the unofficial spokesperson for the project. His photos, showcasing the beauty and dignity of the maned wolves and their harmonious interaction with Walter, began circulating in environmental and scientific publications. One image in particular, captured the morning after the confrontation, showing the wounded old sage resting his head on Walter's lap as the sun rose through the window, became a powerful symbol of the possibility of interspecies connection. "These images are changing perceptions," Emily said as she reviewed the photographs with Nathan. "People are seeing these wolves not as distant, unknown predators, but as complex, emotional beings." Nathan nodded, carefully adjusting his camera lens as he photographed the old sage sleeping peacefully near the fireplace. "This is true conservation," he replied, "not just protecting habitats or counting population numbers. It's making people care, helping them see that these animals have rich, complex inner lives, that they deserve our respect and protection." A week after the incident, as the old sage began taking small steps around the cabin, clearly eager to regain his mobility, an unexpected visitor arrived. A convoy of 3 official vehicles appeared on the road leading to the cabin, bringing Lieutenant Colonel Richards and, to everyone's surprise, the Secretary of Environmental Affairs himself. The delegation was met with a mix of honor and apprehension. Walter, unaccustomed to so much official attention, looked uncomfortable in his best sweater, recently dug out from the bottom of his trunk for the occasion. The wolves, as always sensitive to their human companion's mood, remained alert and slightly distant from the visitors. The secretary, a middle-aged man with graying hair and sharp eyes that suggested considerable intelligence, entered the cabin with evident respect, almost as if visiting a sacred place. "Mr. Thompson," he greeted, extending his hand. "It's an honor to meet you. Lieutenant Colonel Richards told me about the extraordinary events that took place here. I confess I had to see for myself." Walter shook the offered hand, his expression cautious. "Welcome, Mr. Secretary. This is a simple cabin, but you're welcome in it. Simplicity often allows us to see what's truly important," the secretary replied diplomatically. His eyes quickly found the wolves, particularly the old sage, who watched the newcomer with that assessing intensity that had become his trademark. "And this must be the leader I've heard so much about," the secretary remarked, stepping closer cautiously. "That's the old sage," Walter confirmed, "and I respectfully advise keeping a comfortable distance, sir. He's still recovering, and he doesn't know you well." The secretary stopped, heeding the advice. "Of course, forgive my eagerness. It's just, well, this is an extraordinary situation, isn't it? These animals, these maned wolves, displaying behaviors completely unexpected for their species." Dr. Richard, who had quickly taken on the role of scientific mediator, stepped forward with his tablet displaying graphs and data. "It's truly unprecedented, Mr. Secretary. We're documenting complex social behaviors, advanced interspecies communication, even what appears to be deliberate knowledge transmission between generations." The secretary listened intently as Dr. Richard explained the project's preliminary findings, occasionally asking sharp questions that revealed a genuine understanding of the scientific implications. Meanwhile, Emily, Dr. Barbara, and Nathan filled in the details, offering their own observations and interpretations. Throughout the presentation, Walter remained silent, sitting in his rocking chair with the old sage resting quietly at his feet. The wolf, however, stayed watchful, his amber eyes rarely leaving the official visitor. When the scientific briefing concluded, the secretary turned his attention to Walter. "Mr. Thompson, I'd like to hear your perspective. These brilliant scientists have given us data and analysis, but you've been living this experience. What do you believe is happening here?" The direct question caught Walter off guard. He was used to his opinion being considered secondary to formal scientific interpretations. He reflected for a moment, gently stroking the old sage's head as he gathered his thoughts. "What's happening here, Mr. Secretary," he began slowly, "is a rediscovery. These wolves aren't doing anything new or unnatural. They're just reminding us of something we've forgotten." "And what would that be?" asked the secretary, genuinely intrigued. "That the boundaries we draw between species are our creations, not theirs. That the ability to care, to form bonds, to protect those we consider family, isn't uniquely human." Walter paused, looking at the old sage. "And that sometimes, when we lose our way, we need someone very different from us to remind us who we really are." A thoughtful silence followed his words. The secretary gazed at Walter and the wolf beside him, as if seeing something beyond the surface. "That's deeply moving, Mr. Thompson," he finally said. "And I believe it touches the heart of what makes this project so important, beyond its scientific merits." Turning to the larger group, the secretary adopted a more formal tone. "This is why I've come personally today, to announce that the Department of Environmental Affairs, in cooperation with several international conservation partners, is officially establishing the Manned Wolf Special Research Reserve, encompassing this mountain and the surrounding areas." The declaration drew surprised exclamations and quick glances among the scientists. "An official reserve?" asked Dr. Barbara Anderson, clearly moved. "This is extraordinary. The area will be protected by federal legislation," the secretary continued, "with guaranteed funding for ongoing research and conservation measures. Mr. Thompson, if you're willing, your cabin will serve as the central research station, and you'll be officially recognized as the resident guardian." Walter seemed momentarily speechless. Finally, he found his voice. "And the wolves?" he asked, his hand still resting protectively on the old sage. "What will their status be?" The secretary smiled. "The wolves will be recognized as a protected family, free to live as they choose. There will be no attempts to confine or domesticate them. Research will continue, but always with their well-being as the top priority." It was as if an invisible weight had been lifted. Walter exhaled, unaware he'd been holding his breath. "In that case, Mr. Secretary, I accept with gratitude." The secretary seemed about to respond when something unexpected happened. The old sage, who had remained quiet throughout the conversation, slowly stood, ignoring his still healing injury. With deliberate dignity, he walked until he stood directly in front of the secretary. The entire room froze. Even Walter seemed surprised by the wolf's movement. The old sage looked straight into the secretary's eyes, his piercing amber gaze, inscrutable. It was the same gesture he'd made with Dr. Anderson on her first visit, an assessment, a judgment. The secretary, to his credit, stood firm, meeting the gaze without fear but with evident respect. Long seconds passed. Then, in a move that drew gasps from those present, the old sage dipped his head slightly, almost like a formal bow. "My goodness," murmured Dr. Anderson. "He's approving the agreement." The secretary, visibly moved by the moment, inclined his own head in response. "I believe I've just received official confirmation from the most important partner in this endeavor," he said, a slight tremor in his voice. "It's an honor I didn't expect." Nathan had quietly captured the entire exchange with his camera. Later, the photograph of the moment, the powerful secretary and the wild-maned wolf exchanging what appeared unmistakably to be a formal agreement, would become one of the most iconic images of American conservation. When the official delegation finally departed, carrying promises, plans, and a renewed sense of purpose, a feeling of accomplishment filled the small cabin. The sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the mountainous landscape and filling the interior with a warm light that seemed fittingly symbolic. "A historic day," remarked Emily, watching the official vehicles disappear around the bend. Not just for conservation, added Dr. Richard, but for our understanding of interspecies relationships. Walter, however, remained quiet, sitting in his rocking chair with the old sage once again settled at his feet. The other wolves had drawn closer now that the strangers were gone, forming that familiar family circle that had become so natural. "All this began with a storm," Walter murmured, almost to himself, "with 3 wolves knocking at my door." Emily smiled, sitting on the nearby stool. "Sometimes the biggest changes start with the most unlikely encounters. Or the most necessary ones," Walter suggested. Outside, the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, while inside the cabin, the unlikely family, humans and wolves together, rested in the shared warmth of a home they had built together, beyond the boundaries of species, beyond the boundaries of loneliness. The following months brought significant changes to the newly established Manned Wolf Special Research Reserve. Walter's modest cabin was carefully expanded, with a more substantial addition built to accommodate permanent researchers and scientific equipment. All the work was carried out with the utmost respect for the natural environment and the comfort of the wolves, who observed the process with curiosity and surprising tolerance. The old sage had fully recovered from his injury, though a visible scar on his flank remained as a silent reminder of that dramatic night. If possible, he seemed even nobler with this battle mark, his amber eyes deeper and wiser after the ordeal. The scientific project grew in scope and recognition. Researchers and students from across the US and abroad lined up to visit and contribute, all following strict protocols designed to minimize disruption to the extraordinary wolf family. The data collected and analyzed began to revolutionize scientific understanding, not just of manned wolves, but of the intelligence and social complexity of wild canids in general. The little Courage, no longer so little, thrived under the care of his 3 adoptive fathers. He grew strong and confident, learning as much from the adult wolves as, to everyone's surprise, from the humans he lived with daily. Often he was seen watching Walter as the man went about his tasks, seemingly absorbing knowledge through observation. Through careful and non-invasive genetic testing, Dr. Richard finally confirmed his theory about the old sage. The lead wolf indeed carried genetic traits indicative of a natural hybrid, likely with some grey wolf lineage introduced several generations earlier. This discovery helped explain some of his unique physical and behavioral traits, though, as Dr. Richard often emphasized, genetics may explain capabilities, but not choices. On a quiet autumn afternoon, as the leaves began to change and a cool breeze swept through the mountains, Walter sat on his new bench on the extended cabin porch. The old sage, as always, rested nearby, his eyes occasionally opening to assess the surroundings before closing again in quiet contentment. Emily stepped out to join them, carrying 2 steaming mugs of tea. She had become an almost permanent presence at the reserve, leaving her old position at the university to dedicate herself fully to the project. Over the months, a deep friendship had blossomed between her and Walter, a connection built on mutual respect and shared admiration for the extraordinary animals under their care. "Seems like everything is settling in nicely," she remarked, handing Walter a mug and sitting on the bench beside him. "The new research protocols are working. The wolves seem comfortable with the routine, and the first scientific publications are generating exactly the kind of interest we hoped for." Walter nodded, taking a sip of the hot tea. "Good to see people learning to respect the wolves for what they are, not what we wish they'd be." "Exactly," Emily agreed. "The most important thing is that we maintain their status as free agents. They choose to participate, choose when to interact, choose when they need privacy." As they spoke, Watcher, Swift, and Courage returned from one of their daily excursions through the reserve. The 3 emerged at the edge of the forest, carrying what looked like a small rodent they had hunted together. To the researchers, ongoing surprise and delight. They often brought their prey to share with the larger group, a cooperative behavior previously unknown in wild manned wolves. "Look how confident Courage is now," Emily observed, watching the young wolf who had grown considerably over the past months. "He's taking more initiative in the hunt, not just following the adults." "He's finding his place in the family," Walter replied, a small smile touching his weathered lips. "Like all of us." Emily turned to study his profile, noting the subtle changes the months had brought to the old man. When she had first met him, Walter had been a reluctant hermit, wounded by life, retreating into solitude. Now, though still quiet and reserved by nature, there was a peace in his expression, a contentment that came from belonging, from being part of something greater than himself. "You know, this story is inspiring people far beyond these mountains," she said. "Nathan's photographs, the scientific papers, even that short documentary for national TV. People are seeing these wolves and rethinking their relationship with the natural world." Walter nodded thoughtfully. "That's good. Maybe that's what the old sage intended all along." Emily raised her eyebrows. "How so?" "Sometimes I wonder," Walter explained, glancing at the wolf resting peacefully at his feet, "if he knew exactly what he was doing when he brought the others to my door that stormy night. If there was a greater purpose." "You think he planned all this?" Emily asked, the scientist in her instinctively skeptical, though also remarkably open after all she had witnessed. "Not exactly planned," Walter replied slowly. "But maybe understood that two species, two kinds of loneliness could heal each other, and that healing could spread, touch others." Emily considered the idea, watching the four wolves now gathered near the porch, comfortable in the human's presence, yet keeping their wild essence intact. They had defied all expectations, redefined what scientists believed was possible. "It sounds almost mystical put that way," she remarked. "Or maybe just natural," Walter suggested. "Perhaps the mysteries that impress us so deeply are simply truths we've forgotten along the way." At that moment, as if sensing he was the subject of conversation, the old sage opened his eyes and looked directly at Walter. Those amber eyes, so penetrating and wise, met his in perfect silent understanding. No words were needed between them. There never had been. As the sun began its descent behind the mountains, bathing the reserve in golden and amber hues, Walter reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun on that stormy night. From a broken man who had run from life to a guardian of something precious and important, from loneliness to family, from loss to purpose, all because of three wolves who had sought shelter at his door. "Looks like it might snow tonight," Emily remarked, watching the clouds gathering on the horizon. "Yes," Walter agreed, a small smile lighting his weathered face. "And this time we're all ready for the storm, together." The old sage lifted his head, gazing at the sky before turning back to Walter, his eyes holding all the wisdom of the natural world. In that look was a silent promise, a confirmation: family, home, belonging. Some truths transcend species, language, even time itself. Some connections, once formed, last forever. And so, as the first snowflakes began to fall gently over the Maned Wolf Special Research Reserve, the extraordinary family, humans and wolves together, gathered in the expanded cabin that had become their shared home, each enriched by the other's presence, each completing a circle none could form alone. The end of the story. Dear listener, you've just experienced a story that reminds us how deeply the connection between living beings can transcend barriers. If this narrative touched your heart, leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next tales of resilience and unlikely encounters that transform lives.